Adolf Hitler never concealed his deep conviction that the Soviet Union would become the main opponent of his regime and openly spoke about it multiple times. He was a fierce enemy of communism and viewed the vast expanses and rich natural resources of Soviet Russia as a precious gift that, in his opinion, would help the German people become rulers of the earth. In the first months of 1942, while in his secluded hideout in the Bavarian Alps at Berchtesgaden, Hitler was meticulously developing a plan called Operation Barbarossa. This plan entailed a sudden and large-scale attack on the Soviet Union with the aim of breaking its resistance and capturing its extensive territories. Soon after, his army began a frantic push eastward, undergoing stages of modernization and preparing for what they believed would be the most serious and decisive campaign in history. At that time, the Soviet Union, under Stalin's rule, still appeared to maintain the semblance of friendly relations with Germany, despite growing signs of tension. Stalin was trying to prevent the breakup of the alliance because his country was at that moment entirely unprepared for a full-scale war. The mighty Red Army, once considered the largest and most technologically advanced army in the world, was weakened by numerous purges and repressions carried out by Stalin in the late 1930s. Three-quarters of its senior officers had either been executed or sent to camps, drastically reducing the combat readiness of the troops. Despite the outward appearance of stability, the country was in the midst of a deep crisis, moral, organizational, and personnel decline that significantly affected its military effectiveness. Meanwhile, German troops rapidly and aggressively invaded neighboring Poland, which became the first victim of the southwestern aggression. In the context of gradually increasing conflict, Stalin, in desperation to maintain peace and avoid provoking Hitler's wrath, ordered restraint from active actions that could open new fronts and trigger war. However, Hitler had another important goal he deemed necessary to address before launching a large-scale eastward offensive. This was ensuring the security of his southern flank. Allies and neighbors Romania, Bulgaria, and Hungary remained faithful allies of Germany and did not interfere with plans for further expansion. However, events were not unfolding in Germany's favor. In March 1941, pro-British forces overthrew the Yugoslav government, which was perceived as sympathetic to Germany. Its neighbor Greece, whose sentiments also leaned toward Britain, soon became another obstacle for the Germans. Therefore, on April 6, 1941, the German army launched a large-scale offensive against Yugoslavia. Part 2 of 53. Over the course of several days, 33 divisions encountered strong resistance and broke through to the capital, Belgrade, which was quickly captured on April 12. Greece also fell rapidly and without much effort, despite British assistance, and its capital, Athens, was taken in less than 3 weeks. These swift and decisive events removed all obstacles, allowing a full-scale operation in the east to begin without delay, and the path for German troops became almost unobstructed. Operation Barbarossa was planned to involve the mobilization of over 4 million personnel supported by more than 3,000 aircraft, making it grand in scale and ambition. It included 3 simultaneous strikes on different sections of the front. The 1st Army Group, North, was tasked with capturing the Baltic states and taking control of Leningrad, now St. Petersburg. The 2nd Group, Central, aimed at Moscow, the main capital and heart of the country. The 3rd, South, was to seize Ukraine and establish dominance over its rich lands. Upon reviewing this plan, the generals remained silent and kept a quiet bewilderment. They feared that it was too ambitious, which could lead to both overextension of forces and the failure of the entire operation. However, none dared to voice their doubts aloud. The Red Army considerably outnumbered the German forces. On the Western Front alone, nearly 2 million soldiers were positioned, with millions more in reserve. It was evident that the Russians held a commanding numerical advantage, over 20,000 tanks against 6,000 German ones, though many of the Soviet tanks were outdated and less powerful. Nonetheless, even these old tanks posed a serious threat, as their numerical superiority and firepower still formed a formidable combat force that had to be reckoned with. Thus, preparations for the operation were proceeding at full speed despite concerns and disagreements among commanders. The offensive promised to be the most extensive test for both sides, in which every decision could determine the outcome of the entire campaign. For Germany, the key question at the outset of World War II was whether its technological superiority and rapid combat capability could deliver such devastating strikes against Soviet troops to crush them before the numerous forces of the Red Army could unite and mount a coordinated defense, halting the German advance. The operation, known as Barbarossa, launched early on the morning of June 22, 1941 at 3:15 Moscow time. Within the first moments after the start of the campaign, German aviation, the Luftwaffe, began airstrikes on strategic Soviet airfields, inflicting significant damage and creating favorable conditions for ground forces. At the same time, a large-scale ground attack was launched, during which German troops rapidly crossed the Bug River, located at the border of Poland and Soviet territory, advancing eastward. Soon, Hitler's armored units, the tank divisions, penetrated deep into Soviet territory, moving very quickly. In just 2 days they covered more than 80 kilometers, despite the unevenness and obstacles of the terrain. Poorly prepared and poorly equipped counterattacks by the Red Army proved to be disastrously ineffective and were immediately repelled, preventing Soviet troops from halting the assault of their overwhelmingly stronger enemies. As a result, tens of thousands of Soviet soldiers, unable to defend themselves, were encircled, forming what was called a cauldron, and were forced to surrender or become surrounded. Meanwhile, German aircraft dominated the skies. Luftwaffe fully seized control of the airspace, creating the impression that the leadership of the Red Army was paralyzed by the enemy's sudden and powerful offensive. By the end of June, 7 days after the start of the operation, around the 20th of the month, German armored units encountered resistance near Minsk, surrounding large formations of Soviet troops. Soon, infantry units joined them, and more than 300,000 prisoners were taken, at that time the largest military encirclement in history. Germans were often perceived as liberators on occupied territories, especially in Ukraine, where patriotic sentiments against Soviet authority and widespread anti-Russian propaganda contributed to this perception. In Moscow, upon hearing about the beginning of treason and the enemy's sudden successes, Joseph Stalin, according to testimonies, was on the verge of a nervous breakdown. He fell silent for more than a week, only speaking again around June 19 or 20, and on July 3, he addressed the nation, calling for patriotism and unity to defend the motherland. At the same time, in the United Kingdom, Prime Minister Winston Churchill perceived the start of Operation Barbarossa quite differently. He declared that any opponent of Nazi Germany, whether an ally or enemy, had now become a friend of Britain, as their interests coincided in the fight against a common threat. This signaled Britain's readiness to provide comprehensive support to the Soviet Union, and soon an effort was made to strengthen cooperation. As part of this, the government was instructed to send a special mission to Moscow to sign a mutual assistance agreement with Soviet Foreign Minister Vyacheslav Molotov. However, despite actively expanding aid through secret diplomatic channels, Britain could not immediately provide the Soviets with significant military support on a full scale, limiting itself mainly to diplomatic and material assistance. As June gave way to July, German troops continued to advance ever deeper into Soviet territory. It seemed that nothing could stop Hitler and his army. They were advancing into Eastern Europe so quickly, insignificantly, and with such force. But by early July, the first serious strategic mistake had emerged within the ranks of the Nazi command. As a result of a poor decision, the German command lost more than 300,000 of their troops, a devastating human loss. At the same time, forces of the Red Army from the western outskirts of Belarus found themselves encircled. Two powerful counterattacks by German panzer groups, including units under the command of Generals Hogenheim and Hungarian, surrounded large parts of Soviet forces. The Germans persistently urged their commander to proceed with Operation Barbarossa, aiming for the complete destruction of the Soviet armies and victory. Initially, the offensive was successful. Within a week, armored units reached Smolensk, a city located deep within Russia, just a few hundred kilometers from Moscow. Soon, on July 20, movements of German armored personnel carriers and tanks met east of Smolensk, capturing an additional 3,100 Soviet soldiers. After that, a brief pause followed. The Germans focused on regrouping and forcing the Soviets into combat, and only then did they resume their advance. It seemed that despite the impressive speed of the push, most of the Soviet army was still forced to march on foot or on horseback, as the use of motorized equipment was hindered by a lack of fuel and infrastructure. However, despite these difficulties, immediately after the start of the offensive, within 5 days, the troops reached new positions, beginning the clearing of captured territories. In just 9 days after the beginning of Operation Barbarossa, key combat actions were completed, and the German forces reached significant milestones on the way to Moscow, albeit at the cost of heavy human losses and mistakes that would influence the course of the war in the future. By the end of the summer of 1941, Moscow was only 200 kilometers from the advancing German troops, and thus the road to the city was almost open. It seemed that in the near future, the Red Army would be unable to hold the defense, and autumn would be fatal for the capital. At the same time, in other regions of the Soviet Union, the situation was developing differently. The German offensive faced increasing difficulties and resistance. The Red Army successfully conducted counterattacks, inflicted defeats on the enemy, and retreated from their positions. By mid-July, Army Group South was still over 50 miles away from the town of Königsberg, now known as Kaliningrad, and the path to it remained difficult for the enemy to access. In this situation, Hitler decided that the Panzer Grenadier Division under Gorion's command should abandon plans to develop the offensive toward Moscow and focus on the south, strengthening Army Group South. Without objection, Gorion fiercely protested and feared the consequences of such a decision, but Hitler was resolute. He understood that if the unsuccessful assault on Moscow failed and the Red Army was not destroyed, it would be a fatal mistake for the German plans. Soon, alarming signs appeared suggesting that the Red Army might not be as weak and helpless as previously assumed. The advisors convincingly demonstrated that the Soviet people possessed virtually unlimited capabilities. The country's armed forces already included over 16 million conscripted soldiers, and the Red Army had been equipped with new, formidable, and effective weapons. Among such new equipment was the T-34 tank, armed with a 70mm gun, which surpassed outdated models in speed and maneuverability. This tank could move freely across difficult terrain, giving it significant advantages in combat. Nevertheless, even under the conditions of continued German blitzkrieg, it was easy to overlook warning signs indicating potential danger. For example, on August 23, 1941, a group of forces named the Penzadar Group began advancing south. 3 weeks later, on September 20, German tank wedges had already encountered Soviet troops east of Moscow. This brief battle resulted in the complete destruction of 2 more Soviet fronts, and over 500,000 people were killed or captured in the fighting. On the same day, more than 1,000 miles to the north, Army Group North encircled the city of Leningrad, then still the capital of the Russian Empire, now known as St. Petersburg. The city was immediately isolated from the rest of the Soviet Union, cut off from communication lines, supplies, and reinforcements. During the Great Patriotic War, Leningrad found itself besieged, and its defenders faced a difficult siege. Hitler chose not to launch storming operations to take the city by force but preferred to surround it with troops, intending to starve it into surrender. The conditions for surrender were catastrophic for the residents of Leningrad. Food and resources arrived from the Ural Mountains and other remote regions in very limited quantities, and with each month, the death rate increased significantly. In November, the number of those who died from hunger exceeded 11,000. Only in December was a narrow ice road across Lake Ladoga established, allowing additional supplies to be delivered to the city. But even after this, hardships continued. In one day of December, another 3,700 people died from malnutrition and disease. At that same time, the Central Front of the German offensive prepared for the final assault on Moscow, comprising brave and well-armed tank units to lead a swift and powerful attack. Part 6 of 53. The German forces had a significant advantage: twice as many tanks and soldiers on the front lines, and approximately 3 times as many aircraft as the Soviet troops. The assault on the Moscow defenses began on September 20, 1941. The deep German armored breakthrough successfully pierced through the Soviet defenses once again, clearing a path forward. By October 7, the situation had sharply worsened. Even more Soviet units had been encircled, and it seemed that the capital's defenses might collapse. However, Joseph Stalin was determined to defend Moscow to the last. He indicated that the city must hold at all costs and appointed Marshal Gorshkov as the head of the defensive organization. The residents of Moscow mobilized. They began digging trenches everywhere, creating defensive lines, and strengthening key positions. Under these conditions, every citizen felt the full weight of responsibility for the fate of the capital, which at that moment was becoming a symbol of the entire country. The main obstacle to the German advance in January 1941 was the difficult weather conditions of October. During this period, the heaviest autumn rains began, quickly turning roads into impassable swamps inaccessible to any machinery. Each day, the weather worsened. By the end of October, temperatures sharply dropped, and Soviet resistance became increasingly organized and fierce. The entire front faced greater and greater trials. In the area of the Central Army Group, located about 80 kilometers from the outskirts of Moscow, the Germans realized that their plans might be threatened by the caprices of nature, and finally Hitler began to acknowledge how mistaken their decision to delay the assault on the Soviet capital at the start of the year was. At this time, the Southern Army Group reached the coast of the Black Sea, eliminating the last pockets of resistance and capturing over 100,000 Soviet prisoners. However, this part of the front also faced harsh weather conditions, with heavy rains and cold. Despite all the difficulties, on October 24, 1941, German forces successfully captured the city of Kofor, even though temperatures had already started to dip. Their belief that the campaign would conclude by summer gave German soldiers confidence, but the preparations for winter were far from ideal. Many troops were poorly equipped, especially in terms of winter clothing, and suffered from severe cold. On the Moscow front, on December 4, Army Group Center launched a final decisive attempt to break through the Soviet defenses and capture the city. According to intelligence reports, information from the front lines, the leading German units were only 30 kilometers from Red Square, and the golden domes of the Kremlin were already on the horizon, an unmistakable symbol of Moscow. However, that same night, a cold snap returned. Temperatures continued to fall, and tank engines failed under the impact of ice and cold. The weapons turned into unyielding frozen masses, and many soldiers suffered severe frostbite. As a result, on December 5, the German command halted their offensive, and winter weather, like a blanket, covered the city front, playing a crucial role in slowing down the German advance and giving the Red Army a respite. Nevertheless, the German command was confident that they would complete their campaign in the spring. Throughout most of autumn, Stalin's forces were forced to retreat, pressed by superior enemies in numbers and equipment. At the same time, the Soviet leader harbored another troubling concern, that Japanese troops might suddenly attack in Siberia. In November, he received long-awaited confirmation from his main intelligence officer, a messenger from Japan, who assured him that Japan had no intention of opposing Soviet borders. During this time, more than 30 divisions began moving west along the Trans-Siberian Railway towards Moscow. These troops were well-trained, equipped with reliable technology, and experienced in winter combat. By the beginning of December, over 500,000 additional Soviet soldiers had taken up defenses around the capital, forming a formidable military group. During the height of the German offensive on December 5, they were caught off guard by a powerful Russian counterattack. First, Soviet artillery struck a significant blow against the enemy, followed by numerous T-34 tanks breaking through German defensive lines. The Germans, stunned and overwhelmed by the ferocity and scale of such a counterattack, began to retreat hastily. Over the next 7 days, Soviet troops continually tightened the encirclement around the enemy, advancing ever more forcefully and increasing pressure. This was a true blow to Hitler, who had recently reluctantly agreed to a temporary suspension of the attack on Moscow. In December, he took decisive measures. He dismissed his commander-in-chief, Field Marshal Walter von Brauchitsch, and took command himself. The pilot Hungarian, along with 30 other high-ranking officers, was also dismissed, all replaced by new leaders. Forced to take control, Hitler declared that there would be no more retreats and ordered German troops to fight to the last drop of blood if necessary. In this resolve, the Germans found their strength, their front line gradually stabilized, giving way to resilience and perseverance needed to continue the fight. Encouraged by the initial successes of the Red Army and its fierce resistance, Soviet leader Joseph Stalin decided on a large-scale offensive along the entire front. His insistent demand to Front Commander Marshal Georgy Zhukov was clear: a broad campaign was necessary to achieve a breakthrough in the course of hostilities. Despite personal arguments and cautious attempts to persuade Stalin of the need for restraint, he remained unwavering. As a result of these decisions, the fighting continued for the next 4 months without significant change or relief. The battles around the German defensive lines dragged on, sometimes resembling a painful struggle with no clear results, further complicating the difficult situation for Hitler and his command. For the Führer, this became an increasingly heavy burden. He was accustomed to swift victories and rapid advances. However, he now found himself in a very vulnerable position on Soviet territory, facing an enemy that seemingly never surrendered and continued to resist with remarkable resilience. During this challenging period, Russia was no longer the sole problem for Hitler. December 8, 1941, marked the beginning of a new and very dangerous threat. Germany and Japan, without declaring war, suddenly attacked the United States of America. Hitler did not hesitate for long. Almost immediately, he declared war on the United States. Thus, the German leader gained a new, very strong, and dangerous enemy, which significantly complicated the situation for his country. When the 12th month of the year 1942 arrived, a new year began. Hitler was determined to continue offensive operations on the Eastern Front, hoping to change the course of the war in his favor. But to do so, he had to seek new strategies and tactics, as the initial attack plan, designed for a swift victorious conclusion of the campaign, was no longer relevant and only suited the previously set objectives. In conditions where Germany's oil reserves were beginning to run out, making it urgent to find new sources of fuel, he decided to delay further strikes in the north and focus on capturing oil fields in southern Russia. The original operation plan, named Blue, involved an offensive from the south near Conwy. One army group was to advance southward, seizing these vital and strategically important resources. At the same time, another part, the Army Group B, was to cover the flank and ensure the security of the advance along the river. Early in the morning, a fierce clash erupted with Soviet troops, who resisted in an effort to stop the advancing enemy. During the battle, about 200 Soviet soldiers were taken prisoner, and 700 were killed, unsuccessfully trying to hold back the onslaught. As part of the same operation, German forces intensified the siege of Sevastopol, an extremely important strategic point that had been under continuous artillery fire and bombardments for 8 months, including from a huge 380 mm railway gun. By the end of June 1942, the city's defenders were forced to surrender. As a result of the capture of the southern oil resources, German troops gained a trump card, allowing them to confidently continue moving toward their strategic goals. The assault began on June 28, and its main forces quickly crossed the border, reaching the Don River, along which they advanced westward. The troops of Army Groups B successfully reached the river, despite increasingly serious resistance, but by July 9 they were already approaching their final goal. However, Hitler made several serious strategic mistakes. Moving along the river, the command insisted on capturing the city of Stalingrad, which at the time did not hold significant strategic importance, ultimately distracting forces and slowing down the entire campaign. Finding themselves on the brink of a new challenge, the German troops were forced to fight for a city that was then just an expanding target. 2 weeks later, Hitler further exacerbated his mistake. Disappointed by the slow progress in the Caucasus, he ordered a large part of his forces to be redeployed to the mountainous regions. The advance on Stalingrad was delayed, and vast resources were diverted, negatively impacting the overall progress of the offensive. As a result, the fortified troops of the Army Group advancing through the Caucasus Mountains were only 70 miles from the Caspian Sea, threatening to cut off the Soviet Army's escape routes in that region and further complicating the struggle for control over strategic territories. However, subsequently, Hitler again revised his orders. Frustrated by the slow movement of the Southern Army Group toward Stalingrad, he ordered the acceleration of the offensive operations. By August 9, the Nazi German Emperor ordered tank units to move back to the northern line. By that summer's end, the Army Group had already captured the first of the southern oil fields in the M region. However, it soon became clear that these fields had been completely destroyed and were unusable. Without additional reinforcements, continuing the offensive in this direction was entirely impossible, and the richest oil reserves in Central Caucasus and the Caspian Sea remained out of reach for the Germans. During this critical period, Hitler's high command was focused elsewhere. At the end of August, German troops approached the walls of Stalingrad, and a fierce storming of the city's outskirts began, which was named after Hitler's invincible enemy. This battle became one of the most pivotal moments of World War II, shaping the subsequent course of events. On August 17, 1942, the 6th German Army under General Friedrich Paulus launched a final, decisive, avalanche-like assault toward Stalingrad. 6 days later, German tanks reached the Volga River near the northern approaches to the city, and our troops engaged in fierce fighting on the outer defenses. It appeared that Hitler was preparing for his famous victory, hoping to seize the symbolic industrial center. Stalingrad stretched for more than 12 kilometers along the western bank of the Great River. The city had become an impregnable fortress. Its factories produced more than a quarter of all the tractors, trucks, tanks, and artillery supplied to the Soviet front lines daily. The Russian people made every effort, turning this city into a true bastion of defense, which grew increasingly immovable and insurmountable with each passing day. Hitler's decision to send tank divisions to the southern sector of the front gave our troops an additional 2 weeks for final preparation. The German plan was to deliver a decisive blow to the city, leading to a large-scale and exhausting battle, which became one of the longest and most intense operations in the history of the Second World War. The Germans slowly but steadily advanced, street by street, dropping bombs and rapidly attacking the positions of our defenders. The fighting was fierce, house by house, apartment by apartment. Soviet soldiers used sewer communications for cover and to maintain contact, transforming ruins into covert sniper positions. Reinforcing the front via the river was risky and constantly exposed to enemy air raids, yet even under such conditions, thousands of our soldiers found the strength to push forward. By the end of September, the Germans had captured most of the city, nearly reaching the strategic raw material warehouses. On October 14, 1942, General Paulus launched what was to be the final and decisive assault. His forces led the attack, destroying buildings, firing upon the outskirts and courtyards. One German officer noted that success was measured not by the distance covered but by the number of enemies destroyed. The situation appeared to be an unquestionable victory internally, however, in reality, the position was extremely dangerous for German troops. By mid-November, the Soviet army began actively reinforcing the front, more than 1 million soldiers, as well as 11,200 artillery pieces, 900 tanks, and over 1,000 aircraft. On November 19, our troops launched a counteroffensive along the northern front of the German army. After a powerful artillery bombardment of German positions, T-34 tanks and assault units broke through the defenses, leading to numerous captures and prisoners among German soldiers. The following day, Soviet forces successfully completed their operation on the southern front, achieving significant success. By November 23, the two main axes of the offensive linked up west of Stalingrad, completely cutting off the German Sixth Army from possible retreat routes and reinforcements. The moment had come when the German commander, Field Marshal Paulus, could have made a desperate attempt to break out of encirclement and save his troops. However, by order of the higher authorities, he was forced to stay in place and continue resisting until the very end. Hitler himself, issuing orders, persuaded his generals that sufficient stocks of fuel, weapons, and food could be transported into the encircled Stalingrad, and that this would be enough to hold their positions until an opportunity for liberation or rescue arose. As a result of this strategic decision, it became clear that German positions had to be maintained at all costs to prepare for further actions. To support Field Marshal Erich von Manstein, commander of the German forces in the area, Paulus initiated the so-called Winter Storm Operation on December 12, a desperate attempt to break through the Soviet encirclement and escape to freedom. The first 48 hours of this operation were relatively successful, but then the increasing resistance of Soviet troops significantly complicated the task. By December 30, after 2 weeks of fighting, the German rescue mission had reached a dead end and halted just 30 kilometers from the city, which would later become a symbol of fierce struggle. Manstein, observing the situation, proposed to Paulus to make a pause and, if breaking through was impossible, to retreat in order to avoid complete encirclement. However, he was awaiting Hitler's command for such a decision, and the commander could not act without permission. By then, the time had already been irretrievably lost, and there was no hope of salvation. Subsequently, Marshal Zhukov launched the next phase of his large-scale plan, a massive offensive aimed at completely destroying the German forces around the city. As a result of tactical actions, German tanks were pushed far beyond the boundaries of Stalingrad, and by the end of December, all hope for the salvation of the German troops at this strategic point had vanished forever. The situation inside the city grew more and more critical. Attempts to deliver necessary supplies by air had completely failed. To meet their needs, German troops required 700 tons of food, fuel, ammunition, medicines, and other essentials daily, but the maximum delivered was just over 80 tons. In the harsh weather conditions, unprecedented in history, Soviet air forces gradually gained control of the airspace over the city, preventing the delivery of aid and new weapons. Soviet troops, continuing their tenacious fighting, steadily squeezed the encirclement ring. Nearly 200,000 people found themselves trapped. On January 8, the Soviet command called on the Germans to surrender, promising to send captured prisoners to their homeland. However, the Germans refused to capitulate despite the dire circumstances and desperate situation. In January 1943, Paulus was forced to surrender and was taken prisoner. The entire corps of German soldiers encircled was captured, over 100,000 men. Of them, only about 500 returned to Germany after many years, the rest perished or remained prisoners. The Battle of Stalingrad became one of the bloodiest chapters of World War II. The Germans allegedly suffered colossal losses, approximately 300,000 soldiers, along with roughly the same number of their allies. Soviet forces, according to various estimates, lost around the same number of lives, including thousands of civilians affected by bombings and fighting. This conflict marked the largest-scale catastrophe for Germany at that point in the war, and it was not the last. After their defeat at Stalingrad, the Red Army began delivering powerful strikes against German forces across the entire Eastern Front. The victory at Stalingrad became a symbolic triumph for Soviet troops, and their operational commander, Marshal Zhukov, focused his efforts on defeating the German army group still holding positions in the Caucasus. Soviet forces broke through the Germans west of Stalingrad and, as they advanced, by December 1, 1942, they were 20 miles from the city of Rostov. A real threat of complete encirclement of all German forces concentrated in the south emerged, with no possibility of retreat. As a result, despite his initial insistence, Hitler reluctantly allowed the army group to withdraw to avoid an even greater catastrophe. In the following weeks, the Germans conducted skillful rearguard battles, retreating hundreds of thousands of kilometers, destroying everything in their path, and losing significant forces, but managing to preserve some capacity to continue fighting. On January 12, 1943, Soviet troops launched a large-scale offensive under the command of Marshal G.K. Zhukov, which became one of the key events in the Great Patriotic War. During this campaign, our forces broke through a front nearly 500 miles long and simultaneously outnumbered the enemy approximately 7-1. This significant assault was a swift and powerful attempt to shift the balance of power in Eastern Europe. The German commander, General Manstein, faced the necessity of organizing an unexpected and decisive retreat to preserve the combat capability of his forces and avoid full encirclement. Despite difficulties, he managed an impressive withdrawal that partially maintained the fighting potential of German units. By the end of February, Soviet troops had reached the strategically vital city of Krakow and captured the neighboring settlement of Kovel, regaining control over them. This winter offensive by the Soviet armies dealt a crushing blow to the German forces, inflicting heavy losses. In a very short time, within a few weeks, the enemy lost about 1 million of its soldiers, as well as a significant number of tanks and artillery pieces. At the same time, the Red Army maintained substantial reserves of human resources, and thanks to increased weapons production and support from the Allies, the United States and Great Britain, it was able to replenish its forces fairly quickly and effectively. German troops had lost their technological superiority, which had previously been one of their main advantages. The T-34 tank was of particular significance. It proved to be a truly formidable opponent to the German Panzer IV, and the rocket artillery system known as Katyusha inflicted serious losses on German armored forces. Despite the successes of the Soviet army, the German command did not lose hope and continued to formulate plans. Adolf Hitler still dreamed of a preemptive summer offensive, which was supposed to catch the Soviet Union off guard and restore Germany's initiative on the Eastern Front. His plans included capturing the city of Kaka, a strategic hub that seemed a logical starting point for this large-scale operation. The Soviet counteroffensive created a deep bulge in the German lines, an area that extended far into the enemy's rear and represented an enticing opportunity for counterattacks. Hitler recognized the need to cut off and destroy this protrusion to prevent Soviet forces from consolidating and continuing their advance. A powerful new weapon was created for this purpose, a new generation of German tanks specifically designed to combat the formidable Soviet T-34. Among them was the massive, slow 50-ton Tiger, equipped with a deadly 88mm gun, and its frontal armor made it virtually invulnerable to most Soviet tanks of that time. Later, a faster and more maneuverable tank, the Panther, weighing 43 tons and armed with a 95mm gun capable of engaging T-34s at a distance, was developed. These new combat vehicles were so advanced that Hitler was forced to delay the offensive until enough of these tanks could be produced and redeployed to the front. However, when the German forces were ready to attack, the Soviet commander, Marshal Zhukov, who was closely monitoring the situation, quickly realized that an assault was imminent. Soon, he received crucial information from his source within the German High Command, confirming the inevitability of the upcoming offensive. In response, Zhukov ordered the construction of reliable defensive structures, including anti-tank ditches, minefields, and deep rows of barbed wire, creating a formidable defensive belt. He also swiftly reinforced Soviet forces in the area by transferring troops and tanks from less vulnerable sectors of the front to strengthen the defenses. As preparations for the assault commenced, the German troops significantly outnumbered the defenders, who had been warned in advance about the timing of the attack. On July 5, 1943, at the very moment when the enemy was preparing to launch an attack and was deploying its forces, Soviet artillery launched a powerful strike. It was so intense and precise that it caused a significant shock among the German ranks. However, the next morning, despite the loss of command and artillery prestige, German equipment was still moving forward, and the enemy continued their assault. This time, they were better prepared and reinforced, which greatly complicated the task for the Soviet defenders. The chances of a rapid and decisive breakthrough, so anticipated at the beginning of the Blitzkrieg, significantly diminished and almost disappeared. The outcomes of these attempts were surprisingly impressive and not in favor of the Germans. In the north, the German army advanced only 6 miles, losing roughly 25,000 soldiers and more than 200 tanks. It was a very costly victory for them, which clearly did not meet expectations. The situation in the south was somewhat better. The Germans managed to make some progress, striking the Soviet defense and breaking through 25 miles inland. However, even this so-called victory was very expensive. They suffered 10,000 killed troops and destroyed 350 tanks. At moments when success seemed within reach, with a chance for a decisive breakthrough, there was a sense that the operation could go according to plan. On July 12, 1943, when it appeared that the enemy was on the brink of total defeat, Zhukov launched all his reserves into battle. About 900 tanks were committed to the fight, seemingly breaking through the German defenses. During this largest tank battle in human history, nearly 2,000 combat vehicles participated, a true pinnacle of Soviet tank power. Soviet T-34s penetrated enemy lines and began shelling German positions at very close range, preventing the enemy from surpassing them in firepower. After a day of intense fighting, amidst incredible brutality and heroic efforts, the Germans began to retreat. Suffering additional losses of 35 tanks, they had to withdraw, acknowledging their defeat. At the same time, a large-scale and dramatic aerial battle unfolded in the sky. The air forces of both sides fought for air superiority, and ultimately, the Soviet Air Force emerged victorious. This marked an important milestone, enabling Soviet pilots to deploy their powerful I-2 assault aircraft and expand their operational capabilities. As a result of these bloody tank battles, by July 23 of the same year, the Germans had completely lost all the positions they had occupied, returning to their original lines. Hitler's adventure in Crimea was very costly in terms of expenditure and losses, which are estimated at a minimum of 50,000 German soldiers killed and over 700 damaged or destroyed tanks. After such losses, the German command realized that further large-scale offensive operations in the east would become an increasingly insurmountable and risky task. They dared to launch new offensives much less frequently, retreating under the pressure of Soviet troops who continued to occupy positions more stubbornly and advance forward. The Russians, in turn, demonstrated vividly that it had now become quite feasible to pin down the enemy and break his resistance. By the beginning of the summer period of 1943, the Soviet army had begun to shift to active offensives and gradually pushed German forces out of strategically important cities such as Artyomovsk and Belgrade. As a symbol of victory and a testament to the resilience of the Soviet fighters, Joseph Stalin ordered a fireworks display and the firing of 12,124 salutes in Red Square in Moscow to commemorate the heroes who fell for freedom and against the German occupiers. Meanwhile, observing the successes of his troops, Hitler decided to personally oversee all key military decisions. His intervention became immediately noticeable once Axis forces captured the strategic city of Hof. Soviet forces approached it from 3 sides, and in a difficult situation, the German command intended to retreat. However, the Führer personally ordered the cancellation of this retreat, firmly believing that Hof needed to be held at all costs, given its important strategic significance. Hitler was convinced that the territorial acquisitions he called Lebensraum, living space, were necessary for Germany's future power. He vehemently denied the possibility of relinquishing any acquired territories, believing that doing so would weaken the country and threaten its destiny. In his view, victory would still belong to Germany thanks to the size of the army and unwavering will to win. The Germans fortified their positions, hoping for temporary successes, and for several days successfully repelled subsequent Soviet attacks, destroying more than 320 T-34 tanks in the process. These tactical fortifications seemed to create the illusion of success. However, over time, the situation began to change. By the end of August 1943, German positions on the front line had been completely taken over by Soviet troops. Nevertheless, at the last moment, despite all prior directives, Manstein decided to break the order and gave the command to his forces to retreat in order to save their forces from encirclement. The next day, the Red Army launched a large-scale offensive spanning more than 1,000 miles, from Rostov in the south to Smolensk in the north, marking one of the most significant stages in the struggle for control over the eastern part of the country. In the southern part, in Rostov, the Russian breakthrough threatened to completely encircle and trap the German troops, which could have led to a major catastrophe for the enemy. Manstein understood that the situation was spiraling out of control, and he began to request permission from the command to withdraw his forces in order to avoid full encirclement. However, he was only met with an old admonition from Hitler: "Take no action, I will handle it myself." Despite this, the German command did not appear at the front lines, nor did it take control of the unfolding situation. As a result, German units were forced to abandon vital positions and begin a hurried, chaotic retreat, accompanied by numerous obstacles. This retreat was further complicated by the actions of well-prepared partisan groups, some of whom had previously served in the Red Army and found themselves behind enemy lines. The German retreating forces sought to cut their supply lines and communication routes, which led to desperate and brutal treatment of the civilian population remaining in the enemy's advance zone. In response, widespread repression and intimidation measures were implemented to suppress resistance and instill fear among the civilians. A scorched earth policy was launched. German troops destroyed everything that could potentially benefit the enemy if captured: factories, power stations, railways, and bridges, everything essential for maintaining and restoring the territory. The explosion of the largest hydroelectric power plant, which supplied electricity to almost all of Ukraine, was particularly devastating, greatly complicating the further operations of Soviet forces. Along the front center, the Germans crossed the Dnieper River, leaving behind destroyed bridges, which hampered crossings and slowed the movement of the Soviet army. During their retreat, the enemy increasingly destroyed bridge structures, turning the river into a formidable defensive line that had to be fiercely contested. German troops established positions along the western bank, fortifying themselves in trenches and embankments. In response to this offensive maneuver, Stalin declared grandly that the first person to cross the river would be awarded the highest honor of the Soviet Union, to further motivate and boost the morale of his soldiers. By early autumn 1943, Soviet forces controlling the southern bank had established several small fortifications, strong points intended to defend their positions. However, German resistance along the entire Dnieper line continued throughout October, and only in early November did Soviet troops finally manage to take control of a significant portion of the river. They pushed back the enemy from its defensive lines along the entire length, forcing German units to retreat even further west. By the end of 1943, the Red Army had virtually liberated its historic homeland, Russia, from German forces and was confidently advancing westward. By spring of the following year, 1944, the German command was on the brink of complete retreat, while Soviet forces continued increasing their strength, bolstering their numbers of soldiers, equipment, and supplies. The Germans still had only two excellent tanks in their arsenal, the Tiger I and the Panther, both of which performed exceptionally well under mobile defense conditions and offered hope for victory. These tanks were Germany's only hope for equal confrontations on the Eastern Front. At the same time, the Red Army possessed at least twice as many tanks, primarily the most experienced models, T-34s, produced in vast quantities. Factories in Siberian military-industrial centers manufactured 2,000 new tanks each month, allowing for continuous replenishment of the army's equipment. While Hitler had to divide his resources among several fronts, the USSR was able to do so thanks to centralized industrial management and mobilization of all the nation's forces. The strength of the Soviet military machine operated at the edge of its capabilities. 6 million Soviet soldiers fought against less than 3 million Germans. In early January 1944, the forces of the First Ukrainian Front launched an active assault from the north, striking German positions near the town of Kasov, the last major stronghold of the enemy on the way to the promised strategic line along the Dnieper River, which the Germans aimed to turn into an impregnable defensive line. 12 days earlier, the Second Ukrainian Front had begun a large-scale offensive from the south. This offensive followed the successful establishment of a Soviet bridgehead and fortified position that concentrated a powerful troop group. At the start of the battle, a large deployment of troops was carried out to ensure a swift and decisive strike against the enemy. Due to their uncertainty, the Germans could not determine precisely from which direction the first attack would come, complicating their preparations. This was followed by intensive artillery fire concentrated on the enemy's lines of defense. A powerful cloud of explosions and shells set the tone for the entire battle. Soon, numerous tanks appeared on the battlefield, moving swiftly in the assault. The Red Army successfully broke through the German defenses, creating a gap in their lines through which infantry units rushed forward. Infantry divisions quickly advanced, capturing new territories. In the city of Korsun, the German forces realized that their remaining troops in the area were already at their limit. Their situation was nearing collapse, and the commander of German armed forces, Field Marshal Erich von Manstein, traveled to eastern Poland, to Hitler's headquarters, to once again request permission to retreat. However, despite the dire situation, the Führer refused once more, insisting on continued resistance. Over the following week of intense fighting, approximately 60,000 Germans became encircled in what was called the Korsun Pocket, an event that Soviet troops later labeled the Little Stalingrad. German forces made a desperate attempt to break out of the encirclement, but by that time the Reds had already set an ambush. T-34 tanks and cavalry units met the fleeing Germans, inflicting heavy losses. The fighting lasted 2 days, and by the time Korsun was captured, German casualties had reached approximately 30,000 men. After that, the Soviet advance noticeably accelerated, and their progress became significantly faster. This was made possible thanks to an impressive fleet of trucks, the majority of which were supplied by the United States of America. These vehicles provided the troops with everything they needed: ammunition, food, medicine, and moved faster than the enemy, who still largely relied on horses. Additionally, Soviet air forces had air superiority. The Luftwaffe, which traditionally played a crucial role in the German military machine, had to reallocate some of its resources to defend the homeland from American and British bombers. As a result, Russian piston-engine aircraft outperformed Luftwaffe pilots roughly fivefold. Dive bombers of the Stormovik type delivered powerful strikes on German armored vehicles and logistics behind enemy lines, significantly reducing their combat effectiveness and supply capabilities. Despite the obvious catastrophic situation, Hitler refused to accept defeat and developed a new strategy, which he called the policy of impregnable defense. He ordered German troops to build so-called fortified lines, strongpoints that were to be held at all costs, until the last drop of blood. Leaving these fortresses was only permitted by his personal order. This desperate tactic, known as tooth-and-nail defense, dealt a severe blow to the morale of German forces. The first serious test of this new strategy was the battle over the collapse of the town of Kandett in Podolia. Here, 20 division-sized armored brigades faced the threat of encirclement, but Hitler declared the area fortified and absolutely forbade retreat. During fierce fighting, a conflict arose within the military leadership, between Hitler and Manstein, who, seeing the inscription on the wall, "Retreat is death," understood that the decision would negatively affect the fate of the troops. Ultimately, after intense disputes, Manstein managed to secure permission for a breakout. In less than 10 days, about 200,000 soldiers of the German First Army, including Panzerwaffe units, successfully reached enemy positions roughly 100 miles, about 106 kilometers, to the west of their original front lines. However, they suffered massive losses in heavy equipment and weapons. As the events unfolded, Manstein's requests for permission to retreat became increasingly indifferent to Hitler, until eventually he categorically refused to recognize the necessity of a withdrawal, considering this tactical move a betrayal and a sign of weakness. Field Marshal von Manstein was removed from his command positions, leading to significant changes in the leadership of the German army. Meanwhile, the Germans made a desperate attempt to halt the Soviet advancing forces along the river. However, all their efforts proved futile. The Soviet troops broke through the defenses and found themselves beyond the front lines, at the port of Odessa on the Black Sea. In early April 1944, the city was completely cut off from the rest of the territory and was declared a fortress by Hitler, a strategic point in need of protection and siege. Despite directives from the High Command, German troops ignored this order and eventually abandoned the city. Events developed rapidly. On April 10, Soviet forces liberated Odessa from the German occupiers, marking a significant step in freeing southern Ukraine. During this difficult time, Stalin, achieving victories on many fronts, was able to focus his attention on the northern borders, which suffered heavily under Nazi assault. One such critical point was the city of Leningrad, which had been under a severe blockade by German forces for nearly 2 years since early 1942. That winter in the city was remembered for hunger, and about 500,000 residents died from starvation and illnesses caused by the scarcity of food and medicine. Volunteers risking their lives did their best to extinguish fires caused by constant bombings and strengthen the city's defenses. However, by early 1944, despite all efforts, living in Leningrad became almost impossible. Conditions were extremely harsh, and supplies of essentials were running out. Several attempts had been made in previous years to break the blockade, but each ended in failure. In 1942, one such attempt resulted in the capture of over 50,000 Soviet soldiers from the Second Shock Army. The following year, another effort was undertaken to deliver supplies and medical equipment to the city, but even these modest successes did not significantly change the situation. During this entire period, up to 20,000 people per month died from cold, disease, and starvation. Despite endless hardships, Soviet forces continued trying to break the blockade ring. By January 1944, when German forces capitulated and retreated, Stalin finally paid major attention to the dire situation of the besieged city. That month, Soviet troops carried out a covert operation. They infiltrated a small peninsula near Aranenbaum and launched a powerful offensive. The attack began with a 65-minute massed bombing raid, after which the Russian army was able to break through one of the German lines of defense, expanding the breach in their front. At the same time, another Soviet unit launched an assault from the northeast, reaching enemy positions and engaging in combat. German Field Marshal Garfinkler, the commander of the German forces in the area, fought desperately and held out against the onslaught for 3 days. Eventually, he requested Hitler's permission to retreat, as continuing the defense threatened the complete destruction of the army. However, Hitler refused, believing that it was still possible to hold the positions at any cost. Clare argued that the only way to save the remaining forces was a swift and decisive retreat to avoid total annihilation. As a result, he was dismissed from his command and replaced by Major General Walter Mayle, known for his loyalty and conviction, whom they nicknamed Hitler's firefighter. But even he understood that the situation was extremely dangerous, and despite orders, he chose not to obey and abandoned his post. Ultimately, after nearly 2.5 years of bloody blockade, Leningrad was liberated, and the siege was lifted. During this time, almost 1 million Soviet civilians often deprived of even basic living conditions, died. Their deaths became a tragic testament to the resilience and determined resistance of the city, while neighboring countries, especially Finland, began to show signs of change. Finland, fearing a possible Soviet offensive, sent a secret delegation to Moscow in March 1944 to discuss the possible terms of peace. Stalin was not inclined towards leniency and demanded strict concessions. He insisted on the transfer of territories in the north of the country rich in nickel, a strategic metal essential for producing various alloys. Additionally, he demanded the payment of a large reparations sum, hundreds of millions of dollars, a heavy blow to Finland. The Finns refused to accept these terms, and in response, began to prepare for a potential Soviet invasion, fearing further conflicts that could exacerbate an already tense regional situation. However, as later events showed, the higher command of the Soviet Union in the southern direction had far more urgent and important matters than the situation in other regions. The primary focus was on the recently launched offensive operation in Ukraine, because it was there that the Red Army was actively engaged in combat at that time. By the end of 2033, around 12,000 armed German soldiers found themselves in a hopeless situation in the Crimea, encircled and besieged. The German High Command, as usual, did not permit its troops to retreat, and the German units found themselves utterly helpless, awaiting the inevitable start of a Soviet offensive. Part 21 of 53. This assault was scheduled for April 1, 2 months after the lifting of the siege of Leningrad, a symbolic and significant event in the course of the war. At this time, the forces of the Fourth Ukrainian Front launched a large-scale offensive from the north, while simultaneously conducting an auxiliary attack along the eastern borders of the peninsula. In less than a day, the Axis forces were forced to retreat to the very port of Sevastopol, taking shelter within its territory. Hitler ordered that the fortress hold out to the last, despite the obvious hopelessness of such a decision. It was no longer possible to save the situation. Over the next 2 weeks, the German troops, continuing the siege, made unsuccessful attempts to evacuate their personnel by sea. As a result, about 40 men managed to break through and leave the city, but approximately 30,000 defenders were trapped in the port, unable to escape. They tried to retreat south to the beaches, hoping for rescue from other ships belonging to the Germans, but their plans were thwarted by Soviet artillery and airstrikes. By the end of the third day, the Germans surrendered. Meanwhile, in the northwest of the country, now known as Belarus, the Germans continued to control large territories, but the Red Army was capturing new layers of land that truly extended up to the Polish and Romanian borders. This meant that the enemy was forced to defend a front approximately 400 miles long, and its forces were significantly stretched. Military logic suggested that at this stage, it would be prudent to withdraw to more manageable and defensible positions. However, Hitler, obsessed with the idea of preserving and expanding his holdings, categorically rejected such measures. By spring, the exhausted Wehrmacht forces were stretched across the entire Eastern Front, and the German command was in desperate need of reinforcements. They faced a difficult task to find the most effective way to utilize the remaining resources to prevent complete collapse. According to German intelligence reports, the next large-scale Soviet offensive was expected to occur in the Belarusian region, within the current borders of Belarus. But Hitler was adamant and did not share this view. He believed that the main strike would come from the south, targeting Romanian oil fields, giving this strategic objective particular importance. However, both of these assumptions proved wrong, at least in the early stages of the war. In the summer, the Red Army shifted its focus to Finland. Soviet troops began crossing into Karelia, and within 2 days of fighting, Finnish forces were forced to retreat slowly. Over the following month, the Red Army continued to intensify pressure on the northern part of Finland. By August 1944, the Finns were already forced to seek a peace agreement, realizing the futility of continuing resistance. At that time, Stalin was noticeably showing signs of an expansionist tendency, aiming to extend his territory and increase influence in Europe, which later became a common and systematic pattern. He began capturing Latvia, primarily the areas of Finnish Karelia, as well as the resource-rich Pazama nickel region, thereby strengthening his position on the European stage. Subsequently, Stalin shifted his focus to the central part of the continent. In the summer of 1944, he initiated a large-scale operation called Bagration, named after the Russian hero of the Napoleonic Wars. At 5 o'clock in the morning on June 22, exactly 3 years after Hitler's invasion of the Soviet Union, the guns of the Red Army opened a massive artillery barrage on German positions in present-day Belarus, marking the start of a new major offensive phase of the war. At the moment when Soviet troops launched their offensive, what intelligence predictions foresaw came true exactly in the area that German intelligence had warned about months earlier. A decisive positional attack was supposed to take place. However, the Nazi leader, contrary to these warnings, dismissed the dangerous signals and took no adequate protective measures, resulting in the chosen front section being poorly prepared and vulnerable to attack. Unsurprisingly, this strategic mistake became one of the fateful errors for the Führer. During the battle, German troops faced a counterattack when the enemy began shelling their front line over a stretch of 350 meters, with Soviet artillerymen in some places deploying over 400 guns per mile. After a powerful artillery duel, which was becoming increasingly routine, the most formidable Soviet tanks and infantry entered the battlefield, quickly breaking through the enemy's defenses. Unfortunately for the Germans, they had almost no air support, as the overwhelming majority of the Luftwaffe was concentrated on defending their own territory from air raids and assaults. It now became clear that Hitler's strategy of fighting a two-front war was decidedly disadvantageous and dangerously risky. Undoubtedly, the Soviet air forces operated almost without resistance. Their planes struck deep into enemy rear areas, destroying communication lines, impeding reinforcement and logistics movements. In a short period of about 36 hours, German tanks were completely pushed off the battlefield, and about 50,000 soldiers were encircled in one of the cities. As often happened during the war, Hitler initially refused to acknowledge the necessity of retreat, preferring to hold positions at any cost. However, the next day he softened his position, probably realizing that the situation had become catastrophic, but by that point, it was already too late for many of his troops. 4 days later, the city fell, and the losses were significant. Approximately 20,000 Wehrmacht soldiers were killed, and another 10,000 taken prisoner. On the southern front, stretching across the territory of Belarus, the situation repeated itself. Under the pressure of Soviet forces, Hitler became furious and took radical measures. He dismissed his senior Field Marshal Ernst, who was responsible for the defense. In his place, he appointed his trusted associate, Field Marshal Walter, who was immediately entrusted with command. At that same time, cities just outside the outskirts were falling one after another, surrendering to the might of the advancing Red Army. The most prestigious capital in the region, Minsk, was practically within reach of Soviet forces. 2 days later, the city was encircled, and over 100,000 German soldiers found themselves trapped, surrounded on 3 sides by superior enemy forces. Over the course of a week, fierce bombings continued, and the remaining soldiers of the German army surrendered without a fight under the prevailing conditions. Meanwhile, the Russian advance continued toward the Baltic states, primarily aiming for the Lithuanian capital. On the entire eastern front, German troops retreated, leaving behind destroyed cities, scorched earth, and heaps of ruins. In these new battles, they fought with brutal ferocity, committing mass crimes against civilians, perpetrating racial and national atrocities, and destroying everything that hindered their progress. But even such horrors could not prepare the Red Army troops for what they faced next. On July 23, Soviet forces reached the small Polish village of Metin, located near Lublin. And it was there that they encountered the horrifying evidence of Hitler's final solution, Majdanek death camp. This camp was set up as part of a system of industrial extermination facilities, part of a large-scale genocide. The initial reports of its discovery were ignored by both Western countries, which marked one of the Allies' gross errors. 3 days after taking Majdanek, the Red Army soldiers approached the final stage of their struggle, but they faced a new severe test. Stalin, following his brutal logic, was prepared to take the same criminal measures as Hitler only to spread his ideology, communism, not for territorial conquest. By the summer of 1944, Operation Barbarossa had already inflicted significant damage on the German army in the east. During the fighting, over 300,000 members of the Aussie forces were destroyed, and about 1,500 were taken prisoner. This scale of victory by the Soviet troops testified to the triumphant strength of the Red Army and the destruction of the German military machine, which had previously seemed almost invincible. The Red Army halted and took up positions along the Vistula River, south of Warsaw. Stalin was in no hurry to conclude hostilities, as Europe was then in a state of deep turmoil and uncertainty. These upheavals created extremely favorable conditions for the Soviet Union to spread communist ideas and strengthen its position in Europe. The first signs of the political games played by the Soviet leadership were not so much military as informational manipulations, results of various polls used to shape the desired perception of the situation. In early August 1944, the Polish army, under the codename Krajowa, launched a rebellion in Warsaw, firmly fighting against the Nazi occupation forces that had captured the city. The fighters desperately needed help, and at that moment, the Red Army, positioned on Poland's southern borders, was in an ideal position to provide assistance. However, from the strategic perspective of the Soviet leadership, the Krajowa Polish army was considered more as a proxy controlled by the Polish government in exile based in London and allegedly hostile to communist ideas. Therefore, despite the need to help their compatriots, Stalin paid little attention to their suffering. As a result, Polish fighters were brutally suppressed, and their resistance was crushed with terrifying cruelty that shocked the international community. Similarly, the Germans continued to maintain control over Poland with relentless brutality until January 1945, when they were finally pushed out by Soviet forces. This moment marked the beginning of the implementation of the Soviet plan to establish communist regimes across almost all of Eastern Europe. In the north, the Red Army continued to liberate the Baltic states from Hitler's forces, and these territories ultimately became part of the Soviet Union. Near the Latvian capital, Riga, more than 200,000 German soldiers found themselves surrounded behind Soviet lines. However, Hitler, still eager to maintain control and prevent a retreat of his troops, categorically refused to allow them to withdraw. Eventually, German forces were forced to retreat slowly toward the Baltic Sea coast, and by mid-October 1944, they had been pushed to the Koralan Peninsula west of Riga. There, they remained until the end of the war, when they finally surrendered to Soviet forces. Meanwhile, Stalin had already begun to avoid only securing Polish territories. He started evaluating other parts of Eastern Europe and considering further expansion possibilities. Option of a direct attack on Germany through the borders in Western Europe seemed possible. However, from a strategic standpoint, the decision was made to proceed with a rapid offensive thrust southward, bypassing obstacles and resistance along the way. At the end of August 1944, nearly 1,000 tanks and more than 1 million Soviet soldiers were directed into Romanian territory. At that time, the opposing Axis forces defending Romania had fewer than 400 tanks and around 800 combat units of manpower. The opponents almost instantaneously began to retreat across the entire front, yielding to the relentless pressure of Soviet troops. Just 3 days later, resistance was organized around the major encircled German troop groups. Nevertheless, Hitler remained resolute and issued his famous order not to retreat. As a result, intense battles raged for 9 days, claiming the lives of over 80,000 German soldiers, many of whom were either destroyed or captured. The remaining forces, as best they could, managed to organize a belated and partial retreat. By the end of August, Romania's pro-German leader, Marshal Antonescu, was arrested, marking the end of his regime, and the country, lacking resistance, capitulated. Soon after, Soviet troops entered Bucharest, a strategically vital city home to the largest Romanian oil fields. Capturing these resources meant Germany would lose its main oil supply, without which German industry and the army could not sustain their operations for long. Meanwhile, moving south behind the Romanian armies, 3 Soviet armies made a swift advance toward Bulgaria, aiming to seize the country. Although Bulgaria sought to maintain neutrality and avoid entering the conflict, Soviet pressure gradually exerted strong influence, and soon the country found itself under Soviet control. At the same time, other parts of the Red Army continued their rapid march westward toward Yugoslavia, expanding their sphere of influence and strengthening their positions in the region. In the southern border regions of Greece, where German troops were stationed, the outcome of a decisive confrontation turned their forces into encirclement, and their hurried retreat became evident. In panic, they quickly marched through Albanian territory and southern Yugoslavian regions, desperately trying to escape pursuing partisan units hunting every step of theirs. By mid-October 1944, the situation in the region changed dramatically. Soviet troops, advancing toward Europe's western borders, reached the Yugoslavian capital, Belgrade. This strategic point became a kind of turning point. The Red Army, overcoming all obstacles, redirected its forward flow northward and westward, targeting Hungary and then Germany. Meanwhile, decisive measures to strengthen positions began within Germany. Part 26 of 53. The European German territories reinforced their positions by sending fresh divisions to Hungary to support the puppet government, which had become a tool of Nazi policy. But despite all enemy efforts, Soviet troops did not retreat. On the contrary, by the 8th week after reaching Belgrade, they began surrounding and taking control of Budapest. This complex and bloody process lasted more than 6 weeks, and only after that was the pro-Soviet government in Hungary overthrown, and power fully subordinated to Stalin's influence. Thus, by the end of the 20th century, and by the year's end, most of Eastern Europe fell under Soviet control. In a region that until recently was a heterogeneous collection of states, a new reality prevailed. The Baltic countries, including Latvia and Lithuania, as well as Poland, were under strict supervision and administration by Soviet forces. In Romania and Bulgaria, pro-Moscow candidates came to power, and in Yugoslavia and Albania, pro-Soviet forces gained strength. Stalin, meanwhile, successfully completed all his strategic plans, and at this stage of the situation, it was fair to say that he had firmly established his victorious positions. Now that the strongholds of the future Soviet bloc were in place, namely, confident dominance over Eastern Europe, Soviet forces could move freely forward. The occupied territory stretched out before them, and their path led westward, toward Germany. At the same time, on the western fronts, Allied forces, united in an alliance, also approached the German borders, racing for mastery in capturing Berlin. It was already 1944. On the Eastern Front, German troops, under pressure from the Soviet army, had been pushed back to the borders of the Third Reich. Confronted with this advance, Germany suddenly found itself facing a new threat on the western, French front. Preparations were underway for a new large-scale offensive. Months were spent in preparation, and Allied forces conducted intensive drills to test their strength in combat conditions. Hitler had long been closely monitoring the developments. He knew that the inevitable Allied attack would come sooner or later, and the main questions remained only the timing, location, and tactics that would be employed. On the day of the Allied landings in Normandy, France, one of the most massive and significant combat episodes of the Second World War was prepared. Confidence in the inevitability of this attack had been reinforced in British Prime Minister Winston Churchill as early as the first years of the war. He was convinced that sooner or later, Anglo-American troops would enter European territory to break the balance of power. The only unclear issues concerned the timing, the location, and the tactics to be applied. As the Allies began their preparatory operations, British troops had already undertaken several experimental training raids to test their strengths and tactics in combat conditions. One of the first such tests was the British Commandos' raid on the Vaga Islands, a strategic territory off the Norwegian coast occupied by the Nazis. In December 1941, they took a risky and decisive step to scout German defenses and attempt to divert Hitler's forces in the north, in order to create a strong reconnaissance impact. During this raid, the Commandos not only conducted reconnaissance but also blew up a fish oil factory and destroyed part of the coastal defenses. 8 months later, British and Canadian forces once again launched a wide-scale operation, this time for a more significant and larger raid on the D-Ship Bay, a French port located on the Normandy coast. This operation was designed not only as a means to test the enemy's defensive lines but also as a training stage for soldiers who would later participate in the landing. Unfortunately, this time the confrontation ended in catastrophe. When the assault ships approached the main beach, they encountered intense and precisely aimed enemy artillery fire. Those who managed to reach the shore were immediately seized by panic and laid down, trying to take cover under fire. At the same moment, support tanks that had ridden over the narrow shingled beaches became stuck and unable to proceed further. Only a few crews managed to break through the sea barrier, and the number of participants in this landing exceeded 30,000, marking one of the gloomiest episodes in their combat history. On the pages of the history of the Great Patriotic War and World War II, hundreds of thousands of Allied soldiers either lost their lives or were taken prisoner. Their fates became an important lesson for Britain and all countries fighting against Nazism. This difficult experience taught the British that it was futile to attempt to storm a port occupied by German forces directly and without preparation. The strategic failure at D-Day, which became a bitter lesson, reinforced the conviction that an invasion of Europe should only be carried out after long and meticulous preparation. It was the realization of the importance of thorough organization and planning that led Winston Churchill to consider the necessity of preparing an operation that would bring the Allies onto the European continent and help turn the tide of the war. In April 1944, at an important Allied conference held in Washington, D.C., Churchill and U.S. President Franklin D. Roosevelt agreed on a final date for the operation, which was later known as Operation Overlord. Previously, it was called by its code name Seaborne, and the plan was to launch this large-scale invasion of France in the summer of the following year. By the time the date was set, the Germans had already begun taking extensive measures to strengthen their defenses. Since the winter of 1940, they had started constructing a system of fortifications known as the Atlantic Wall, which was to stretch along the entire European coast from the Danish borders to Spain. To accomplish this, their engineers built numerous artillery positions, fortified beaches with minefields, laid barbed wire across the terrain, and created obstacles at strategic points to hinder Allied landings. Demonstrating his confidence, Hitler declared himself the greatest builder of fortifications in history. In the summer of 1942, following major offensive operations along the Atlantic coast, German defenses were significantly reinforced. The Führer ordered an increase in military presence in the region to enhance its defenses. Field Marshal Hans-Jürgen von Hoth, commanding forces on the Western Front, was further subordinate to 15 additional divisions. However, the length of the western coastline, stretching 200,000 miles, made it impossible to fully man and effectively oversee all positions. Therefore, the command faced a difficult decision regarding troop deployment: to station the main forces in permanent positions or to keep some in reserve to respond to a possible invasion. This issue sparked intense debate among the German High Command. Von Schwedt, one of the strategists, proposed keeping substantial reserves northwest of Paris. He believed these reserve units could serve as a strong response once the precise landing sites of the Allies were known. But the sector commander overseeing the area from Holland to the French coast, the respected Field Marshal Rommel, held a different view. He was concerned about the strength of the Allied air group, which had air superiority. Having gained experience in North Africa, Rommel was well aware that Allied aircraft could destroy any ground forces before they had a chance to resist. He also carefully studied the state of the Atlantic Wall and concluded that most parts of it were in poor condition and required urgent repairs. Based on this, he decided to position tank forces as close as possible to the likely landing sites to ensure immediate and decisive suppression of any aggression, without waiting for reinforcements. Hitler, fully aware of the vulnerabilities at several points of the wall and the weaknesses of the reserves, decided to limit command options. He provided only limited forces in reserve, to be used at his own discretion. Although the final decision on the allocation of reserves remained with him, other reinforcements were scattered along the coast based on Rommel's instructions. However, implementing this strategy proved to be extremely difficult. The insufficient reserve forces, the lack of tanks and armored vehicles near the intended landing channels, led to the defense being inadequately prepared. As a result, despite the efforts of the German commanders, the readiness of personnel and equipment at potential breakthrough points was weak, making preparations for the decisive battle an extremely challenging task. By the fall of 1943, the situation in the United Kingdom was tense and quite complicated. Allied strategists faced a difficult choice regarding the location of the future landing operation, as much depended on the correctness of the decision. Most quickly, the chief planner, General Frederick Morgan, realized that there were two most likely options for the initial landing. The first was the route toward the Pas-de-Calais area, located south of Normandy, since this route was the shortest by sea and provided the fastest and most perilous delivery of troops and equipment to the enemy. That is why initially, the Pas-de-Calais option was considered the favorite. However, Morgan clearly understood that this route was quite predictable. He realized that the Germans, armed with reconnaissance, would be expecting exactly that, a short and obvious route. Then an idea arose: to deceive the enemy, create an illusion that the landing would occur at Pas-de-Calais, while the actual operation would be carried out in Normandy, on a more difficult but strategically advantageous site. This risky maneuver marked the beginning of a large-scale military game, the outcome of which largely depended on the fate of hundreds of thousands of soldiers and countless logistical services. Soon, the Allies began reconnaissance activities. Reconnaissance aircraft rapidly flew over the French coast, gathering vital information about the disposition of defenses, the position of German troops, and the state of the shoreline. This was part of the grand preparation for the largest invasion in the history of warfare. The Atlantic Wall, a system of fortifications and defensive structures, was under the control of the enemy in France. At the same time, resistance fighters, operating secretly and decisively, landed on the coast to collect sand samples, test the possibilities for landing armored vehicles, and assess how German positions were strengthening. Northern France became the most thoroughly detailed and meticulously researched coastline in the historical periods of military conflict. The importance of reliable port facilities became rapidly apparent. On one hand, coastal defenses seemed insurmountable. The disaster at Dieppe, where an attack on a German port ended in failure, clearly demonstrated how risky such operations could be. As a result, British engineers were forced to come up with an innovative solution. Huge concrete structures were being constructed on the coast in Britain, which could later be towed to the French coast and flooded, thus creating artificial harbors. These massive structures were given a code name, Mulberry MBO. Their purpose was to deliver fuel and supplies via a pipeline that was unwound from enormous reels and then laid across the seafloor. The length of such an underwater pipeline reached approximately 100 miles. The most astonishing aspect was that pumping stations disguised as ordinary ice cream shops were carefully hidden along the entire length of the pipeline to ensure the operation's safety and secrecy. However, after some time, intelligence sources identified another problem: how to evacuate the first wave of the landing force from the beaches and breach the formidable German defensive lines to ensure safe further advance. The answer came in the form of a new brilliant solution. General Percy Haber, one of the pioneers in armored technology, was appointed to oversee the development and deployment of specialized equipment and tactics. His arsenal included various unique devices that sometimes elicited a smile from soldiers, for example, flamethrowers for rapid suppression of enemy positions, floating tanks for amphibious landings, tank pontoons for clearing minefields, structures for creating durable pathways through sand and mud, armored ramps for crossing sea walls and ditches, as well as transports capable of ferrying enemy obstacles and bridges over wide ditches. Everything was designed to ensure rapid and painless movement, overcoming any cover in fortifications. But this alone did not solve the main problem. The threat remained that the Germans could significantly strengthen their positions by sending additional reinforcements before the Allied forces managed to secure a foothold and begin their advance. Thus arose the need to mislead the Germans and confuse them about the exact location of the intended invasion until the very last moment. As a result, a large-scale operation codenamed Bodyguard was launched. This was a complex and meticulously planned disinformation campaign, in which German double agents in Britain began transmitting vast amounts of false and artificially created information through specially established channels. The aim of this disinformation game was to make it appear that the main landings were planned in the Pagès area, a town on the French coast, while any lesser-scale attacks toward Normandy were merely diversions designed to mislead German intelligence. All of this allowed the Allies to create the illusion that their main forces were concentrated in one place, and that the successful invasion would come as a surprise and full shock to the enemy. To further confuse and mislead the opponent, Allied forces undertook a cunning and carefully strategized operation to create false targets and illusions. Specifically, a fictitious military unit was formed, called First Army Group of the United States of America. This fictional operation was located in Kentonbange, directly opposite the main street of the city. The main intelligence center and the person responsible for conducting this operation was General George Patton. It is worth noting that shortly before this, he had been relieved of duty in Sicily following an incident involving a wounded soldier, but despite that, his role in the strategic game remained key. German intelligence, fully trusting, considered Patton one of the best generals among the Allies for attacking operations, and anticipated that he would be the main figure in launching a large-scale invasion of Western Europe. To reinforce the illusion of real combat activity and create the effect of a prepared army, the Allies used radio transmissions that mimicked genuine wireless messages, which were broadcast through a special device, the AR-52, known among specialists as 11 at the Alpha radio station. These signals were specifically intended for reconnaissance aircraft patrolling over British territory, aiming to create the German perception that active preparations for an assault were underway in the region. The fields in Kent County were scattered with inflatable tanks and mock military equipment, as well as cleverly designed traces simulating recent troop movements. Moreover, wooden models of airplanes appeared along the Kensey Bay coast, and in the ports, fake landing crafts made of tarpaulin were placed, sometimes with images of non-existent crews. These decoys were designed to give reconnaissance and enemy forces the complete impression that main forces were concentrated here for an amphibious landing. Some of these inflatable ships and dummy soldiers were manned by personnel, but in reality, these were reserve units specially trained to distract and confuse. By 1944, the Allies had already appointed American General Dwight Eisenhower as Supreme Commander of the combined forces preparing for the invasion of Europe. Meanwhile, British General Bernard Montgomery was assigned command of the 1st Assault Units. D-Day was set for June 5, 2 months before the planned operation. During these weeks, Eisenhower and his subordinates launched active airstrikes to destroy German communications and prepare the ground for the landing. Everything was planned meticulously to give the impression that the main thrust was expected to be in the PIC region, a strategy supported by the creation of false landmarks, radio reconnaissance, and fake movements of equipment. As the date of the operation approached, the number of Allied troops in England exceeded 2 million soldiers, supported by over 3,000 tanks and approximately 1,200 aircraft, making the Allies a formidable military force. The Germans, on their part, fully understood that an invasion was inevitable but were entirely deceived and trusted everything they were shown. Reports of the landing preparations carefully concealed the true plan, and all enemy forces were focused on key points thought to be the target of the attack. The Allies concentrated their efforts specifically in the Kent area, believing that the main landing operation would most likely take place there. Everything was proceeding according to the planned scenario, and it seemed that everything was going smoothly. However, fate played its part. Suddenly, the weather changed, and a heavy rainstorm descended upon the skies. Visibility greatly deteriorated, and the channel turned stormy, creating serious obstacles to the conduct of the operation. By June 4, 1944, assault troops had boarded the landing craft, and the fleet, consisting of over 5,000 ships, began moving toward the coast. But the storm and bad weather were so intense that the decision to proceed with the landing had to be postponed. The ships returned to port, and soldiers and crews faced immense tension and disappointment. Early the next morning, the military command gathered again with the troop leaders. Navy officers were determined to continue the operation despite the worsening weather, but aviation commanders expressed serious doubts. They feared that poor visibility would make supporting the air forces impossible or ineffective. After long discussions and deliberations, General Eisenhower made the final decision. He uttered a short but significant phrase, "Let's go." And with this decision, the operation that would go down in history as Overlord, the greatest amphibious invasion of all time, began. On the first night of June 6, 1944, around 1:30 in the morning, the campaign to liberate Europe was launched. British and American aircraft crews towed gliders and landed near the northern coast of France. Then, after the landing, the gliders were released and guided toward the most important bridges across the Channel, located east of Normandy, which provided strategic superiority and the possibility of rapid advancement. A large-scale and decisive campaign by the Allies to invade Hitler's empire in Western Europe commenced, which essentially became one of the most critical operations of World War II. Just a few hours after American paratroopers landed 50 kilometers west of the expected line, near a small village, a fierce firefight erupted. Inside this small settlement, a real struggle for control began, and despite initial difficulties and clashes with German positions, after about 3 hours, the village fell into Allied hands. This battle became one of the most significant and bloodiest episodes in the history of global warfare, demonstrating the resolve of both sides and the strategic importance of the upcoming operation. An hour after this battle, German sentries guarding the Normandy coast were shocked by the sudden appearance of a formidable army that emerged unexpectedly from the fog, of which they were unaware. In the darkness of night, the Allied fleet moved forward, and carefully coordinated countermeasures successfully misled German radar, causing them to mistake another part of the forces, supposedly approaching the French coast near Polackali, further east, as the main strike force. Allied warships positioned off the Normandy shores began precision bombardments of German positions, while aircraft, like waves, with relentless force and accuracy, soared at high altitude, supporting ground combat with bombs and attacks. At this moment, assault units started their advance toward the shore, overcoming obstacles and dangers. However, the Germans offered stubborn resistance, opening fire with artillery and machine guns on the landing troops. Some landing craft were sunk or damaged, while others ran into underwater obstacles hindering their further progress. Despite these serious obstacles, at 6:30 a.m., the first waves of the assault troops landed on the beaches. On the western edge of the landing zone, the force of the 4th U.S. Infantry Division captured a section called Utah. Over the next 2 hours, this area joined forces that had recently landed near St. Mir. Meanwhile, on the neighboring sector, at Omaha Beach, the situation was far more complex and tense. This beach was like an impenetrable fortress, guarded by towering cliffs and narrow passages serving as natural defenses. While the 1st U.S. Infantry Division was on the shore, it faced fierce fire from German machine guns, and numerous floating tanks intended to support the landing were sunk. Many soldiers were practically trapped, unable to advance further or find cover. However, despite this formidable resistance, some brave fighters managed to climb the cliffs, push through the fire, and hold strategic positions along the shoreline. In the central part of the landing zone, on the section occupied by the British 5th Infantry Division, the assault took place at Gold Beach. Once again, British forces faced significant difficulties and resistance, but thanks to resilience and organization, they managed to establish combat operations and soon made progress. On the neighboring southern part of this zone, at Juno Beach, the 3rd Canadian Infantry Division landed, and the conditions for their actions were equally severe. The situation here was very tense. Defenders, armed to the best of their ability, fought fiercely. Support from British troops provided decisive aid, without which their advance would have been much more difficult. On the far left flank, at the so-called Sword Beach, the British 3rd Division encountered almost minimal resistance. Here, the Germans displayed poor organization and inefficiency. Over the course of several hours, its commandos merged with the troops landed on specialized platform devices near the Cucumber Canal, and together they secured the captured positions. By noon, all the beachheads in the landing zone had been successfully established and consolidated. The timing of the attack caught the Germans off guard, as they expected the Allies to delay or wait for better weather conditions to launch their assault. However, in reality, the weather conditions that favored the attack allowed the Allies to act without delay. General Rommel, the well-known German commander responsible for defending the northwest coast of France, decided to take advantage of the worsening weather and traveled to Germany to visit his family, leaving the situation largely unattended for a time. His close subordinate in Normandy, General Friedrich Dahlmann, was more than 100 miles away from the combat zone, engaged in drills and preparatory activities, which further reduced the likelihood of his immediate intervention. Against this backdrop, the German forces had only one commanding officer remaining in control of all of Western Europe, Field Marshal Ganrouanet. He was in his headquarters, carefully monitoring the situation, but needed to obtain Hitler's approval to relocate reserve forces to the front. At that time, the Führer, engrossed in a deep sleep, paid no attention to what was happening. Only by noon, when news of the sudden invasion finally reached him, did Hitler perceive it as something insignificant, inclined to underestimate the scale of the events. He remained convinced that the main blow of the German forces would still be delivered in Normandy, as this was the point he considered most suitable for an attack. It was only closer to evening, when the scale of the landing became apparent to all participants, that Hitler ordered the reserves to be withdrawn. However, these forces were positioned too far away to provide instant resistance or assist in repelling the advancing Allied troops. Despite the heroic resilience and desperate resistance of German units, the beachheads at Utah, Gold, and Juno remained secure thanks to the steadfastness of the defenders. Meanwhile, the situation at Amiens, another strategic location, remained more uncertain and risky. The German resistance there was so persistent and strong that American troops, for the first time during the campaign, faced significant difficulties. They could not advance more than a mile inland. By the evening of June 6, 12 hours after the start of the landings, over 100,000 Allied soldiers had landed on the Normandy beaches. This result served as a true testament to thorough planning, courage, and ingenuity of commanders and soldiers alike. The first day of this grand operation was successful, but it was only the beginning. Much greater and harder work lay ahead. The Allies' new task was to build up their forces, expand the captured bridgeheads, and push their offensive further inland. Europe was experiencing the second day of the largest invasion in history, known as Siborne, the operation that would enter history as one of the greatest military ventures. Thousands of Allied troops, having completed the landings, marched toward Los Angeles but were forced to confront the harsh and sometimes hostile reality of the Normandy landscape. This patchwork terrain of forests, villages, and small agricultural fields became an ideal battleground for German armored divisions and machine gun nests. Despite heavy losses, the Allied forces continued to advance, largely thanks to powerful air support that fundamentally shifted the balance of power and was created from the air. When reinforcements, the so-called Panzerfahnenrate, arrived at the battlefield, their muscles were exhausted from continuous German air raids, preventing them from immediately organizing a large-scale counterattack. The French resistance movement continued to organize various actions behind enemy lines, setting up ambushes for German columns, sabotaging bridges, and hindering German progress. As a result, the SS Division Panzers and other German units took more than 2 weeks to cover a distance that would normally take no more than 3 days. During this process, German troops exhibited particular fury, striking at the French civilian population and showing no mercy to villages or their inhabitants. For example, the village of Rorsasoulan and its 642 residents were destroyed by artillery fire. After 4 days of fierce fighting, all the Allied units landing on the shores finally managed to unite their forces and establish a single front line. However, their progress inland reached only 10 miles, indicating the seriousness of the resistance and the difficulties faced. 6 days after the start of the operation, British Commander General Montgomery launched a powerful offensive against the town of Tsoan, a key strategic point in the region. Britain deployed its 7th Armored Division, widely known as the Desert Rats for its combat expertise and tenacity. But the frontline units encountered serious resistance. The Germans countered with 4 Tiger tanks, legendary vehicles with thick armor and deadly weapons. The current battle became desperate and almost hopeless for the British Shermans. Their guns proved too weak to effectively face the German Tigers, and their shells could not penetrate them. Additionally, the Shermans were particularly vulnerable. Most of them ran on gasoline, and a hit could easily cause them to catch fire. The Germans, observing this, nicknamed the Shermans of Ronson after Leiters, which perfectly reflected their vulnerability and weak points. This nickname corresponded to their actual fragility. In fierce combat, they became easy targets for German tanks and fire. In less than 15 minutes, a well-armed and well-prepared German tank unit destroyed more than 10 British vehicles. Meanwhile, fierce battles continued at Caen, where Allied forces tried to break through the German defenses. The Allies persistently stormed the city but faced strong resistance, falling behind German tanks that confidently held their positions. They hoped to receive necessary support from air and artillery forces, counting on the air power and heavy artillery to change the ongoing situation. However, despite these hopes, the intensified support was insufficient to halt the enemy's advance. The Desert Rats, symbols of the indomitable and cunning German troops, retreated, leaving control of Caen in German hands. At the same time, on the Western Front, American armies launched an offensive operation against the vital port of Cherbourg. Ignoring weather conditions, initial calculations suggested it would take approximately 10 days to approach this strategic target. The first week of the invasion could be called a relative lull. Supplies and reinforcements were delivered through specially constructed artificial harbors, creating the illusion of steady supply. However, soon the weather sharply deteriorated. A storm disrupted the Allies' plans. The sea near Amach Harbour was wrecked, and another British harbour at Malbury was so severely damaged that it could not operate for several days. These stormy February conditions significantly slowed the flow of reinforcements and heightened the importance of the port of Cherbourg as the only remaining supply point. When American troops finally approached the port facilities, they were met by a resilient German garrison. Fierce fighting erupted over every building, with soldiers on both sides demonstrating courage and determination. It took the Allies an entire week to finally capture the city. However, the entire port was looted and destroyed by the retreating Germans. Restoring it became necessary, and another whole month of intense work was required, as storms turned the area into a muddy swamp and low clouds made air support impossible. The task was complicated by the recently arrived elite German troops from a second unit of special forces, sent by the Germans to reinforce the city's defenses. For days after the start of the attacks, the British were again forced to halt, but then, as clouds cleared, Allied pilots, about 500 bombers, rushed toward their targets, delivering powerful strikes on enemy positions. British forces, having broken through the devastated ruins, advanced towards the northern outskirts of the city, although each building was turning into a natural stronghold for the German defensive forces. Allied casualties increased significantly, and after 48 hours, the offensive was again forced to halt. 3 weeks later, Commander Montgomery launched the fourth attempt. The plan was to capture the remaining German strongpoints and then push further south into France. During the last 2 days of fierce fighting, the city finally fell. This success created the impression that the path for British tanks to advance south was open, but the German command prepared itself for stiff resistance. As a result, the British forces' advance was once again stopped. At the same time, on the Western Front, where key events were unfolding, American troops entered the scene. The situation developed so favorably that the battles around Congo almost entirely absorbed the German defenders. As the American armies prepared to continue their advance into France, German resistance was very weak. Everything pointed to the Allies being able to initiate a planned offensive. Finally, everything was ready for the long-anticipated breakthrough. At 1935 on July 25, 1944, over 1,500 Allied aircraft took to the skies and delivered a powerful strike on a 4-kilometer section of the German front line south of Cherbourg. This massive bombing raid marked the beginning of Operation Cobra, the breakthrough of American forces into France. The German defenders were stunned by the scale of the attack, impressed by the strength and massiveness of the assault, and many American soldiers were surprised by how formidable the enemy forces appeared. The plan was for the bombers to fly eastward parallel to the U.S. front line, aiming to minimize the risk of being hit by enemy fire. Thus, the Allies prepared a strategic launch of an operation that could become a decisive stage in the liberation of France. However, a significant portion of the airstrikes against American positions proved unsuccessful. Numerous bombs, despite many attempts, failed to hit their targets. As a result, more than 100 American soldiers were either wounded or killed. During the advance, American troops faced an unexpected situation. Many German soldiers, despite heavy losses and destruction, remained in formation, continuing to resist stubbornly. The fierce fighting reached its peak, and it seemed that the Americans would not be able to break through the German defensive line, as enemy resistance grew more and more unyielding. In early July, exactly 3 weeks after the Normandy landings, significant changes occurred within the German Armed Forces High Command. Hitler unexpectedly dismissed Field Marshal G. von Rundstedt, the commander-in-chief of the Wehrmacht, accusing him of displaying defeatist tendencies. Rundstedt himself did not hide his belief that the struggle for Germany would become insurmountable. In his place, Field Marshal Gaunamer was appointed, a recently returned veteran from the Eastern Front who, by that time, was insufficiently familiar with the situation in the West, in northwestern France. Just 2 weeks after this significant appointment, early in the morning, the second most important German frontline commander, Colonel Rommel, was seriously wounded. His staff car was shot down by a British fighter aircraft, forcing him to awaken his injured officers. After this incident, the Nazi leadership faced even greater difficulties and challenges. An event that shook the German top brass was the assassination attempt on Adolf Hitler's life, which took place on July 20, 1944. The explosion, organized by Colonel Klaus Schenk, Count Stauffenberg, a disillusioned aristocrat and war hero, was staged in a conference room intended for planning at Hitler's Eastern European headquarters. 4 officers were killed as a result of the explosion, while the dictator himself sustained only minor injuries, taking cover behind a large oak conference table. Stauffenberg's plan was thwarted. He was quickly and brutally suppressed and imprisoned. Count Stauffenberg was shot, and his closest associates were tried and subsequently executed. Despite his injuries, Hitler, demonstrating composure, decided to visit the wounded in the hospital, which only increased his distrust of his senior officers. This event further strengthened his resolve to tightly control everything happening at the front. Returning to France, General George Patton resumed command of combat operations. He ordered his troops to disperse to minimize losses and strengthen the defense. Under his leadership, forces captured the city of Rennes, then Mainz, and directed their efforts toward Lamar, bypassing the main German positions and avoiding direct confrontation with the enemy. Meanwhile, German troops continued fierce fighting with British and Canadian units near Celles. American forces advanced from the south, and British from the north, giving the impression that the enemy in Normandy would soon be encircled. Hitler, as before, ordered no retreat, full confidence in the impenetrability of their defenses instilling hope in his heart. However, when the Allies launched a massive assault, German troops were forced to retreat, relentlessly pursued by Allied aircraft and artillery, which inflicted irreparable damage. The German army's losses in these battles were horrific, and the scale of destruction was staggering. On August 20, 1944, Allied forces, advancing from both the north and the south, met at a narrow pass which was later named Pass after the nearby village. This narrow and tightly confined corridor became a real trap for the German soldiers, as a significant portion of their troops found themselves encircled. As a result of the clash, over 10,000 Germans were killed, and another 500 were taken prisoner. The battlefield turned into chaos and ruins, and the German resistance in Western Europe was entirely broken. Far to the south of Europe, on the picturesque French Mediterranean coast in the area known as Siborne, a major event of World War II took place, the second large-scale Allied offensive. The United States troops arrived there practically unsupported and, encountering minimal resistance, immediately launched active operations. Soon, troops from the Free French Army, coming from regions of Europe and North Africa where the Germans had already suffered defeat and were retreating to escape the advancing Allies, joined them. This joint landings elicited mixed reactions from the British command. Some considered it a diversionary maneuver that would distract the Germans from a more crucial operation, while others believed it had strategic importance. However, for America, such opinions were irrelevant, and for a long time, the Siborne landing was regarded as a key stage in the overall campaign to liberate Europe from Nazi control. When the Allies landed, the French civilian population greeted them with warmth and hope for liberation. The public eagerly welcomed the arrival of new troops, which boosted the soldiers' confidence. Soon after the landing, the troops began actively advancing up the Rhone River, rapidly liberating occupied regions. By September 3, 1944, the Lyon Valley was successfully liberated, and just 10 days later, on September 13, Allied forces reached the strategically important city of Jona. There, they established contact with General Patton's forces, advancing from western France. German formations across the region found themselves in a very difficult position, they were forced to retreat after 3 weeks of intense but futile fighting caused by the sudden Allied offensive. This invasion, in the context of the European campaign, became a true catalyst for France's liberation. It significantly accelerated the liberation process, including the capital Paris, where French resistance fighters launched a national uprising against the German occupation, fighting for their land and independence. By the beginning of 1944, or the early 20th century, the Third Reich, led by Adolf Hitler, was already on the brink of collapse. In the western part of Europe, Allied forces were slowly but steadily approaching the German border, while in the east, the Red Army was crossing Polish territory and moving towards Germany's borders in an effort to decisively crush the fascist command. The resistance of the German troops was conducted with persistence that seemed hopeless, especially considering the scale of the Allied advance. The Allies continued to fight with determination, pushing towards Berlin from both the east and west, hoping for the rapid conclusion of this battle. Yet, even the strongest German resistance proved futile. By May of 1944, Hitler was already dead, and Germany was finally defeated. A particularly significant event at this time was in February 1945, when Allied forces concentrated their strength at the Rhine River for a final push northward toward the strategically important city of Gerald. During these days, a huge number of soldiers were deployed, among them the 21st Army under Field Marshal Bernardino Mandragora, the 12th Army commanded by General Omar Bradley, and the 3rd Army of the United States, led by General George Patton. In early February of that year, the main Allied forces launched a large-scale attack through the wooded terrain defended by the Germans. The enemy resistance was fierce, especially on the southern flank, where the Germans employed a flooding tactic, opening sluice gates at several dams, inundating the surrounding areas and complicating the advance. Despite these serious obstacles, within just 2 months, by the beginning of March, the Allies managed to reach the western bank of the Rhine and control approximately 60 miles of its shoreline. The next logical step was to cross the river slightly southward to seize new bridgeheads and continue the offensive. Meanwhile, Bradley's army was also actively moving eastward in search of a favorable route to the Rhine. On March 8, 1945, they reached the shores of Cologne. However, they encountered Adolf Hitler's order to destroy all bridges across the river in order to impede the Allied military progress. At the same time, as American troops continued their movement south, they discovered a single intact bridge near the small town of Remagen. Launching a storming attack on it, they bravely extended their forces and overcame the resistance of remaining German units, sweeping everything in their path and continuing the assault in southern directions. As soon as the Allied forces prepared to cross the bridge, a powerful explosion suddenly erupted. Despite this, the structure remained intact and unharmed. In a state of complete despair and solidarity, a small group of American soldiers decisively crossed the river, cutting all wires that appeared to be demolition cables. These bold actions allowed the commanders to begin rapid response measures. They started an operational evacuation of their troops while simultaneously creating conditions for a breakthrough into enemy territory in Berlin. The news of the capture of the bridge in Remagen sparked a storm of anger and rage from Hitler himself. In response to this event, a group of 5 junior officers was arrested and later executed by firing squad, and the harsh German Western commander, Field Marshal Ferdinand, was dismissed from his position. This was already the second time in less than 12 months that such a dismissal had occurred, indicating a crisis in the German command. He was replaced by a more experienced and proven commander, Field Marshal Albert Kesselring, who previously led operations in North Africa and Italy. Over the following week, the Germans launched desperate air attacks aimed at destroying the bridge in Remagen to prevent its capture. However, all these attempts failed, none succeeded. Suddenly, on March 17, during repairs to the bridge, engineers faced a tragedy. The structure under their hands collapsed, claiming the lives of 28 people. This dealt a serious blow to German plans and halted the first large-scale Allied breakthrough into Germany. Meanwhile, in the north, under General Montgomery's command, preparations were underway for the first large-scale crossing of the Rhine River. On March 13, 177,000 British and American airborne troops were dropped to seize key positions east of the river. They faced intense anti-aircraft fire and serious resistance. One of the newsreels described hundreds of gliders risking their lives during dangerous landings. Some were damaged, and fuselages fell just 10 meters from the ground. More than half of the gliders were destroyed or damaged before landing. Despite these difficulties, within a few hours, the situation began to change. Paratroopers managed to connect with Montgomery's ground forces, allowing the capture of the bridge and enabling the Allies' advance. For the ambitious and determined Montgomery, this moment should have been the pinnacle of success, a triumph of his strategy, but he was suddenly surpassed by General Patton, who unexpectedly crossed the Rim near the Apennines and had already stepped onto German soil. This rivalry between Montgomery and the American generals only complicated and intensified tensions within the Allied command. In the following days, even more crossings were organized on both sides, and the German defensive line began to literally collapse. In the north, Montgomery advanced deeper into Germany toward the city of Mannheim, while General Bradley's forces, including the 3rd American Army under Patton's command, pushed eastward, moving toward the Morer-Ila River. German cities Frankfurt and Fort Minden found themselves besieged. Their defenders were pushed back, marking the final collapse of the German troops' defense on this front. Despite their desperate resistance to the ongoing offensive, there was no longer any doubt that their fate was sealed and defeat inevitable. The only unanswered question was when exactly their final surrender would occur. This became clear as the Western Allies, bearing heavy casualties and overcoming resistance, confidently advanced across the entire territory of Western Germany. At the same time, the Red Army, under Joseph Stalin's leadership, was actively preparing for a large-scale offensive along Germany's eastern border. Their forces demonstrated significant combat capability despite the hardships of the war and were well prepared for the new assault. Meanwhile, German command found itself in deep crisis. Their supply of ammunition and weapons had dwindled to such an extent that Germans had to use rifles dating back to World War I. Hitler's intelligence concluded that the Red Army's infantry strength far exceeded their own, roughly 11 Russian soldiers for every German soldier. Additionally, the Red Army possessed many more tanks and artillery guns. However, Hitler's offensive and strategic resources in the West were already completely exhausted. On January 12, 1945, the Russian offensive was launched with a powerful artillery bombardment covering a front of 300 miles. Just 1 week later, Soviet forces burst into war-ravaged regions, continuing their western advance. They approached the German border just 300 meters away, indicating an extremely high intensity of combat. In the south, the Second Soviet Army captured a Polish city, roughly on the same day, January 18. Soon after, Soviet troops hurried westward, expanding their control over Polish territory by taking major cities such as Poznan and Breslau. In these cities, they encountered fortified German resistance pockets, which were subsequently eliminated in fierce fighting. By the end of January 1945, Soviet armies had already crossed the German border and reached the Oder River, marking a crucial moment in the offensive. At that time, they were only an hour's drive east of Berlin, a fact that became a real triumph for the experienced Russian commander Georgy Zhukov. In just 14 days, he had managed to cover more than 300 miles, making it one of the fastest and most impressive military offensives in history. Zhukov's armies decided to halt temporarily to regroup and replenish ammunition, as a prolonged pause was required to restore human and material resources. Soon, a second Soviet army joined their positions, establishing defenses in the south along the Nisar River. At the same time, the Third Russian Army was successfully pushing the remnants of German forces out of East Prussia, advancing towards the port city of Königsberg, now known as Kaliningrad. During this period, Hitler appointed SS leader Heinrich Himmler to oversee the region's defense, assigning him to command the fortified German troops in the adjacent area. This was a troubling sign of how critical and dangerous the situation for Germany had become. Hitler increasingly doubted the competence of his generals and commanders, believing they were insufficiently capable of handling the looming threat. However, Himmler lacked military experience or specialized education, making his appointment quite risky. In February 1945, the Germans under Himmler's leadership were defeated by the advancing Russian forces. At the same time, Hitler had the opportunity to position large reserve forces of the German army, which still remained on the Curzon Spit in occupied Latvia. However, for reasons not entirely clear, he refused to authorize their transition to the offensive or their support of frontline troops. In his strange and often inexplicable decisions, he remained committed to the idea of holding on to his power, despite the evident hopelessness of the situation and the wastage of resources. As a result, about 200,000 German soldiers spent the last months of the war without active combat, confined to static positions, without undertaking serious offensive operations, which only accelerated their ultimate defeat. By that time, the Soviet army was nearly at the final stage of its operation, preparing for a powerful assault on Berlin, which was less than 50 miles from their positions. This offensive was inevitable, and no efforts could stop the advance of Soviet troops. Meanwhile, behind German lines, genuine panic broke out among the civilian population. It was impossible to conceal the horror that the Germans had inflicted upon the Soviet people. Numerous testimonies testified to this. Men, women, and children watched entire towns and villages disappear from the map, destroyed by bombings and combat operations, along with their inhabitants, innocent people caught as hostages of the war. Realizing the scale of destruction and suffering, Soviet soldiers felt a strong desire for revenge. Images of the atrocities committed by the Germans in the Soviet Union formed in their minds, and these memories made them more determined to punish the perpetrators. Disturbing and shocking reports came in of how the German army and population were subject to heinous crimes, stories of violence, looting, and even the murder of innocent civilians, which only intensified the anger and desire for retribution among the Soviet troops. In the harsh, sometimes seemingly endless winter, when temperatures dropped below zero, over 5 million Germans living on the Eastern Front and in occupied territories were forced to leave their homes. They fled in an attempt to escape the approaching front, heading westward. 4 million of them were evacuated by sea from German ports on the Baltic Sea coast. However, these vessels fell into the trap of Soviet submarines, which deliberately targeted the evacuation ships. As a result, 24 German passenger ships were sunk, including the famous cruise liner Wilhelm Gustloff. This ship carried over 10,000 people, and only about 1,000 of them survived the tragedy. The event became recorded as one of the greatest maritime disasters in history because the loss of such a large number of lives in a single incident was unprecedented. Meanwhile, at the head of Germany's defense, in Germany, acting chief of staff for Adolf Hitler, General Heinrich Goering, persistently urged the Führer to concentrate all remaining forces on defending Berlin. He insisted that all available troops be diverted to the capital in the hope of delaying the advancing Russian forces, even if only slightly. Hitler agreed and ordered the withdrawal of the elite 6th Panzer Division from the front lines, intending it to become a powerful element of the city's defense. However, instead of sending it directly to Berlin, he sent these troops to Hungary, motivated by the need to protect the last major source of oil, the Hungarian oil fields located west of Lake Balaton. This decision proved to be very risky and reckless, as the Hungarian tank forces were significantly outnumbered by Soviet troops. Unfavorable weather also played a cruel trick. A sudden storm turned the landscape into a muddy quagmire, greatly hindering troop movements. For several days, Hungarian tank crews tried desperately to contain the Russian offensive, but circumstances quickly turned against them. The Russian forces continued their pressure, and soon the Hungarian defense was forced to abandon their territory and retreat toward Austria. Almost the entire Hungarian army soon found itself engaged in defensive battles around Vienna as the Red Army rapidly approached the Austrian capital. By that time, the 6th SS Army, responsible for defending the region, was already completely depleted. Its commander, SS General Sepp Dietrich, knew the situation was hopeless. He didn't hide the fact himself. His words at that moment accurately reflected the reality. We call ourselves the 6th Panzer Army because we have only 6 combat vehicles left. On April 24, the Soviet forces completely overran the outdated German defensive positions and captured Vienna, marking the definitive defeat of German forces in that region. The military elite faced a crucial and complex question: who would reach mighty Berlin first, the Soviet armies or the Western Allies? The heartbeat of the war intensified at this moment because a real race for the city had begun. This final stage was not only a military and strategic battle but also became a political competition. By March of 1935, the Soviet army had established positions along the Oder River and was preparing to assault the German capital. This situation put the Western Allies' command on the front line in a difficult choice. Although Berlin was only 300 miles from their forward positions, most Western commanders aimed to break through to the city as quickly as possible to bypass the Russians and seize it first. Nonetheless, a month earlier, at the conference in the Black Sea port of Yalta, the Allied leaders agreed to divide Germany into spheres of influence. As a result, Berlin essentially fell under Soviet control, and Eisenhower was given a strict order to ignore the city and concentrate all efforts on capturing other important German regions. This strategic arrangement marked the final stage of World War II, its decisive battle, woven from complex military decisions, political agreements, and human destinies. On April 1, American troops encircled German industrial cities, which at that time were under Soviet control. German soldiers, demonstrating commendable persistence, mounted stubborn resistance in these strategically vital areas, trying to prevent their complete capture. However, 2 weeks after the start of the operation, when defenses were breached and the region fell into Allied hands, more than 325,000 German military personnel were forced to surrender. This number became one of the largest in the course of the war. Such a massive number of prisoners testify to the serious losses Germany suffered at that time. Yet, losses were not only in prisoners and destruction but also came at a heavier price among the command staff. German Field Marshal Walter von Brauchitsch was killed, one of the experienced and respected military leaders. Elsewhere in the country, the situation unfolded much more complexly and confusingly. Resistance was not only fierce but also often varied in form and tactics, complicating the advance of troops. During this period, the army under Bradley's command was storming Germany, striving to achieve its strategic objectives. By the end of April 18, thousands of American soldiers had already carved out a vital corridor toward the Czech border, thus dividing the path to victory for the German Reich into two parts, which held great significance for the further course of the war. To the north of Canada's borders, the First Army under Montgomery's command began liberating the Netherlands, which had suffered particularly severely during the harsh winter of 2045. German occupation forces, aiming to protect their strategic interests, deliberately evacuated large supplies of food, fuel, and materials from the country, causing a massive technological disaster in these regions. As a result, widespread cases of death from hunger and cold occurred in some areas, exacerbating the overall tragedy. In mid-April, on the 15th, the Dutch city of Arum was liberated. This brilliant success happened very quickly and with minimal losses. Already the next day, April 20th, Canadian troops captured Groningen, a city located near the northern coast of the country, marking another significant step in the liberation. However, these victories had little to no significant impact on the distribution of German forces, as they were forced to concentrate elsewhere. Soon, German troops found themselves surrounded near Amsterdam, which until recently was considered the center of German occupation authority. Under these circumstances, a ceasefire agreement was reached and Allied gunfire erupted in the air, while aircraft occasionally roared overhead over the devastated lands, sometimes roaring like roaring beasts, concerned about the fate of civilians. They dropped food supplies and medicines to assist the population in the worst conditions. Also during this period, the Second British Army under Montgomery was actively advancing in northern Germany, relentlessly pushing through German territory. On April 4, a British aircraft crashed in Asbruck, marking the beginning of complex battles for control of the port of Bremen. Here, the British had to fight fierce enemy resistance, and only after 9 days of street battles for each house and each alley was the port finally seized. After that, 2 days later, Montgomery's armies reached the Elbe River, near the town of Lemberg. The path to victory was not only long but also marked by the discovery of horrific evidence of Nazi regime crimes. In early April 1945, American troops entering central Germany took control of a concentration camp near Weimar, a place filled with horror and suffering. General Eisenhower, shaken by what he saw, personally visited the site to verify the extent of the catastrophe. Most prisoners had recently been evacuated to fleeing camps or killed. However, after their evacuation, only decomposed bodies and heaps of bones remained. 8 days later, British troops captured another concentration camp in Bain, north of Hanover. There, they discovered about 70,000 prisoners. Many of them were already dead, while others suffered from terrible illnesses, hunger, and exhausting diseases. A radio message from British correspondent Richard Dimbley, who had visited this camp, conveyed horrific, painful details. He described how he, having overcome the barrier wall, found himself in a world turned into a nightmare. There, living people lay with their heads leaning against corpses, and around them, like ghosts, exhausted and hopeless creatures moved, already too weak to move or look, seemingly just waiting for their turn to die, engulfed by despair and death. What was happening at that moment became one of the most terrible and inhumane manifestations of human cruelty and despair in history. There was no room for any misunderstanding about its nature. Everything was carefully planned and carried out with slow, calculated movements. At the same time, in southern Europe, in Italy, away from the main battle lines and events, the collapse of the German front had begun, which had long been approaching its end. German troops, despite holding strong and well-fortified positions in the Apennines, faced an increasing onslaught by Allied forces. However, it was then that the Allied commander in the Mediterranean, Sir Harold Alexander, decided to launch a spring offensive, as if reminding the enemy of his resolve and ability to counterattack. Starting from April 9, 1945, British forces launched their assault, systematically pushing German units back across all sections of the front. With swift and decisive movement, they liberated each territory unjustly occupied, strengthening their positions in the heart of Italy. 5 days later, American forces also entered active combat and quickly reached the southern bank of the Plius River, which served as an important defensive line for the Germans. As a result, German troops were forced to abandon their fortifications and retreat northward, crossing to the opposite bank of the river. Nevertheless, the German commander in Italy, General Heinrich von Wittinghoff, understood perfectly well that holding back the Allied offensive in this part of Europe for long would be impossible. He realized that the strength of his army was inevitably depleting and decided to enter negotiations. Ultimately, on April 29, he unconditionally surrendered, recognizing that resistance was no longer feasible. This capitulation took effect on May 1, 1945, becoming the first official surrender of German armed forces on European territory and playing a crucial role in the final termination of the bloody war. After such a prolonged series of battles and tests, the moment finally arrived when American and Soviet troops, having endured many hardships, were able to meet on the Elbe River, near the town of Lipa. This event became one of the most anticipated and touching moments in the world, as many people had been dreaming for many years of returning home, of a peaceful life, and of the possibility to find refuge in their native homes after being forced to spend a long time away from their homeland, in places filled with danger and destruction. The meeting of the West and the East, filled with lively energy and a sense of relief, took place on April 26. On this day, the 69th Infantry Division, commanded by Major General Ronhardt, crossed the Elbe River to meet Soviet soldiers waiting on the opposite bank, ready to continue joint operations. Everything had been prepared for a decisive offensive on Berlin. Hitler, overwhelmed by despair and hopelessness, in the last moment, turned to the youth and the elderly, those who could still defend the city. His thousand-year Reich was in its final stage of a struggle for survival, acting as the last bastion on the path to victory for the Allied forces. On April 1, 1945, Joseph Stalin assembled the commanding officers of his troops in Moscow to give the final orders for the assault on the German capital. Marshal Georgy Zhukov, the most successful and renowned commander of the Soviet Union, was to deliver the main blow from the crossing of the Oder River. At the same time, the Second Soviet Front led by Marshal Ivan Konev was to cross the Nazerna River and launch an offensive into Germany, bypassing Berlin, aiming to encircle the German defensive lines. These two powerful groups formed an unrivaled armada, numbering over 2 million men, equipped with 6,000 tanks and self-propelled guns, as well as 400 artillery pieces, mortars, and missile launchers. Faced with such strength, the German defenders believed that their resistance was the only chance to slow down the enemy. However, German defensive positions were well prepared. The city was guarded by just over 1 million soldiers, many of whom occupied reliable fortifications, especially on the heights of Sayola, a well-known rocky elevation that dominated the Oder River Valley and served as the main point of city defense. The defending forces were a very diverse group: battle-hardened veterans, SS fanatics, as well as young inexperienced recruits, some only 14 years old, and elderly citizens of the People's Army. By that time, Hitler had long since taken refuge in a bunker beneath the Reich Chancellery in Berlin, completely immersed in despair and hopelessness, awaiting the final battle that would decide the fate of his regime and country. He was suffering from an incurable disease and awkwardness, spending most of his time issuing increasingly unrealistic orders to imaginary armies and detachments. His public appearances became increasingly rare and less substantive, but in early March he was still persuaded to visit a few military units preparing to defend the line by the lake. Later that month, he appeared in public to inspect a small group of young soldiers and officers. This visit marked his last public appearance before cameras and eyewitnesses. On April 13, 1945, the American President Franklin D. Roosevelt died suddenly of a heart attack, shocking the entire world. He was one of the leading architects of World War II and left a legacy that would forever change the future of both America and the global community. On the same day, Nazi propaganda minister Joseph Goebbels used Roosevelt's death to convince his compatriots that the Allies would soon disintegrate and that a German victory was still possible. However, all illusions and hopes faded very quickly, and hope withered away. Less than 3 days after Roosevelt's death, Soviet troops launched their assault on Berlin. The Soviet armed forces had one artillery piece for every 13 meters of front, and it seemed that the German defenses should have been weak and easily overcome. Yet, the German command foresaw this and made a clever move. They retreated to avoid massive bombings and destruction. As a result, when the Soviet infantry advanced, they encountered unexpectedly fierce resistance. In a desperate attempt to handle this difficult situation, the commander took in reckless action. He sent in his tanks to break through the defenses, hoping to force a breakthrough. However, both equipment and personnel quickly found themselves in trouble. At the same time, in the south, the advance of the Second Army Group under Konev also faced difficulties. Zhukov's troops successfully crossed the Dnieper River and approached the next obstacle, the Spree River. Stalin, aiming to sow competition and motivate the best commanders, allowed Konev to send his tanks northwards, toward Berlin, fueling the race to seize the city. Stalin was thrilled by this competitive struggle and enthusiastically observed the unfolding events. After several days of intense fighting, Zhukov's forces entered the eastern districts of Berlin, occupying its suburbs, while Konev was tasked with advancing from the south. German resistance became increasingly desperate, but despite the opposition, on April 25, Soviet armies met in the city center, marking the start of the final operation to capture Berlin. During the fighting, hundreds of people moved from their positions, and civilians began leaving shelters and bunkers, fearing the continuation of destructive battles. However, Soviet soldiers often ignored signs of capitulation, and cases of violence and gross abuse against German women and girls sadly became commonplace in the chaos. 3 days later, by the morning of May 1, the remaining defenders of the city found themselves trapped in a narrow strip in the central part of Berlin, which was no more than 2 miles wide. Every street and every building turned into a battlefield, and any movement could have been the last. On the morning of April 30, Soviet troops began the assault on the German parliament building, known as the Reichstag. Stalin regarded this symbol of national power as a crucial target for the final defeat of the Nazis, but resistance was very strong, and fire on the building was intense and sustained. As a result, it was decided to demolish it with heavy artillery to finally destroy the enemy's stronghold. The German defenders fought ferociously, moving from room to room and battling in the corridors and on the stairs. The fighting lasted about 4 hours, and only then was a red victory banner finally raised on one of the captured structures. This happened early in the morning of May 1, 1945. Everything was captured on film, and these scenes forever immortalized an important moment. However, by that time, Adolf Hitler had long been dead. His death occurred in April of the same year, at a time when the war raged in the streets, and his mad ambitions and dreams of world domination were doomed to total failure. The world found itself embroiled in a large-scale and brutal war that tore the continent apart, destroying everything in its path and claiming the lives of millions of innocents, among which the fate of the Jews was especially tragic, suffering from relentless persecution and extermination. Ultimately, after years of fighting and destruction, the Führer himself ended his life on his own roof, committing suicide to avoid falling into enemy hands. His last companion and lover was Eva Braun, with whom he had recently entered into marriage. Their partially burned bodies were buried in the garden of the Reich Chancellery, but the struggle for Germany's future in peace continued. Difficult days lay ahead, marking the end of an era. Before his death, Hitler appointed Admiral Karl Donitz as his successor, a man who, in those difficult times, tried to preserve at least some hope of saving the country. In the following days, new leadership engaged all efforts to save Germany from complete and irrevocable defeat, as the country had already reached the limits of its capabilities. The most frightening events took place in the night of May 1, just 1 day after Hitler's death. At that time, the German people were told that their leader had fallen heroically in battle, and that they must continue resisting the enemy. However, the new governing bodies of the country were already disintegrating, as if they lacked unity and strength, because chaos and discord reigned within Germany. In Berlin, amidst ruins and destruction, Joseph Goebbels and Martin Bormann attempted to negotiate a comprehensive and unconditional ceasefire with the United States and the Soviet Union, negotiating with the Soviet commander, Marshal Zhukov. However, he demanded the unconditional surrender of all German armed forces without any conditions, which was unattainable for Bormann and Goebbels, who were fighting in the encircled city. That same night, tragic events unfolded. Goebbels and his wife took horrific action, killing their 6 children and then taking their own lives, unwilling to be captured and to leave their country in ruins. Soon after, Bormann disappeared, vanishing into obscurity. Only in the 90s, through DNA analysis, was his identity established and confirming that the body found in Berlin was indeed his. The following morning marked Berlin's capitulation. By midday, the fighting in the capital had ceased completely. Across the entire country, the pace of capitulation accelerated at an astonishing rate, as if fate itself was rushing to end the bloody war. Regional commanders and high military officials immediately initiated contact with allies in the anti-Hitler coalition to surrender the remaining forces. For example, General Dönitz, commanding German troops in the north of the country, sent a delegation to British Field Marshal Montgomery, offering to surrender all units located in northern Germany. However, Montgomery stated that he had no authority to accept surrender on behalf of American or Soviet commands and could only sign for his own troops fighting under his command. Ultimately, General Dönitz was forced to agree to this condition, despite the fact that it meant continuing resistance elsewhere in Germany. The situation grew more complicated. Now, General Dönitz sent yet another delegation to the Supreme Allied Commander, General Eisenhower. The Allied commander initially proposed negotiations for a peace agreement with Western countries, trying to avoid discussions of capitulation to the Soviet Union, fully aware of the horrific losses suffered by the Soviet people throughout the war. General Eisenhower was persistent and demanded the unconditional surrender of all German forces, regardless of their location. Faced with the hopelessness of the situation, Dönitz was ultimately forced to retreat and accept the Allies' terms. Finally, on the night of May 7, 1945, at 2:41 a.m., at the headquarters of the Allied commander in France, General Alfred Jodl, who had led the operational department for 6 years, prepared and signed a document of unconditional German surrender. This important agreement was signed in the presence of representatives of the Western Allied powers, Chief of Staff General Eisenhower's aide Walter Budell Smith, and on behalf of the Soviet Union, General Ivan Suslov. These signatures officially brought an end to the bloodshed in Europe, marking the surrender of Nazi Germany. However, despite this, Stalin, the leader of the Soviet Union, expressed dissatisfaction with the agreement. He understood the extent of the human and material losses suffered by the Soviet people during the war and could not accept that Germany, which had endured such severe destruction, might receive any concessions. Therefore, he revoked Suslov's order and declared that Russia would accept capitulation only in Berlin, to definitively confirm its victory and honor. This meant that the day after the signing of the surrender document, Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel, having repudiated previous arrangements, signed a second act of capitulation, sealing the final conclusion of hostilities. In January 1932, when the enemy was an increasing threat and the world was filled with anxiety, the Soviet Union signed a crucial document that satisfied Stalin's strict requirements. This official act was signed by Marshal Zhukov on behalf of the entire Soviet Union, symbolizing the will and interests of the country, and simultaneously by the esteemed Marshal of Aviation Sir Arthur Tedder, representing the Western Allies, embodying the united efforts of the anti-fascist front. In the same month, near the small town of Casablanca, a meeting took place that would forever be remembered as a landmark event. It was an important conversation between the late President Franklin D. Roosevelt of the United States and Prime Minister Winston Churchill of Great Britain. During this meeting, they declared the necessity of a complete and unconditional surrender of the entire fascist bloc in Europe, setting a clear condition for ending the hostilities. This resolution became an official rule, and soon the entire continent of Europe was filled with a sense that victory was imminent, while celebrations and hopeful expectations for the end of the long and bloody war began in the United States. Officially, Victory Day in Europe was commemorated on May 8, the day after Germany's surrender. This day marked the triumph of the anti-fascist forces and became a symbol of liberation from an era of horrors and devastation that had engulfed the continent. However, during the festive celebrations, many people began to clearly realize that the victory gained was only the first step along a long road. Two extremely serious issues unfolded before them. The first was that the war in the Pacific continued, and Japan was still fighting without surrendering. The second was that Europe's wounds were so deep and torn apart that restoring the country required colossal efforts and resources. The number of victims, those who perished in German concentration camps, prisoners who endured terrible trials, and those who suffered, needed relentless help to rebuild their shattered lives. At the same time, many German prisoners awaited their fate, what was in store for them after their defeat. The military had to undergo complex screenings to determine their fate and to identify and apprehend the main war criminals responsible for the atrocities that shocked the world. One of the primary tasks was to confront the Nazi leadership, as they were the masterminds behind the heinous crimes. As a result, the key figures of the German command were detained, among whom were prominent individuals such as Hermann Göring, head of the Luftwaffe, who was publicly arrested and displayed to the world as a symbol of the international efforts to hold these criminals accountable. In addition to Göring, both civilian and military leaders, such as Albert Speer and Erich Dorneritz, were brought to justice. The Nuremberg trials, held in a German city, drew the intense attention of the global community. The sentences handed down ranged from death penalty to decades of imprisonment, based on each individual's degree of involvement in crimes against humanity. One tragic epilogue was that Hermann Göring, a steadfast leader, chose to take his own life at the last moment rather than face execution. 2 months after Germany's surrender, Allied forces from different countries of the anti-Hitler coalition met in a small suburb of Berlin, symbolically concluding the chain of victorious alliances. After the end of hostilities, Germany was divided into 4 occupation zones: Soviet, British, American, and French. Although Berlin was situated in the Soviet zone, it was also divided into sections controlled by the 3 Allied powers, reflecting complex agreements and temporary arrangements. The people of Europe faced a decisive choice: some came under the control of Western powers, defending democratic values and the capitalist system, while others fell under the influence of Communist Russia, which aimed to establish its dominance and ideological model. All these incredible difficulties and challenges could have been overcome if not for the ongoing war in the Pacific, which remained one of the key objectives. It was essential to win this final conflict to conclude the war definitively and establish lasting peace.